As more and more begin to know, the status quo has got to go. They're bound to say yes to a man named Dr. No, a man who makes the establishment panic. Grassroots are growing way too wild, too organic.
So despite the massive bombing campaign and ground invasion in Gaza, a senior Pentagon official believes Israel has not come close to taking out Hamas's leadership, and this was reported by the New York Times on Saturday. So the report reads, quote, one senior U.S. defense official who spoke on condition of anonymity to discuss sensitive details said the operations so far have not come close to destroying Hamas's senior and middle leadership ranks, end quote. So according to Gaza's health ministry, at least 9,770 Palestinians have been killed in the Israeli onslaught, including 4,008 children. So think about that death toll. And I know Biden has tried to say that they're lying about this, but then you had the UN and aid groups that operate on the ground saying that it's reliable, and they actually believe the number to be higher because it doesn't count everybody under the rubble and people that were buried before, instead of sending their bodies to the hospital. So anyway, this New York Times report said that the U.S. was making suggestions to Israel to reduce civilian casualties, such as using smaller bombs. Apparently, that's one suggestion the U.S. gave to Israel. But when it comes down to it, the Biden administration is refusing to leverage military aid or refusing to use any kind of leverage over Israel. According to the Washington Post, the U.S. is not conditioning military aid or using other leverage it has over Israel because, and this is a quote from the article, I wanted to read this excerpt. It says, quote, it would be so politically unpopular in any administration, and partly because aides say Biden himself has a personal attachment to Israel, end quote. And this is Israel's heritage minister, Amichai Eliyahu. I probably butchered his name. But he said that dropping a nuclear bomb on the Gaza Strip was an option for Israel and claimed that there are no innocent civilians in the enclave. So according to the Times of Israel, Eliyahu said in a radio interview that dropping a nuke is one of the possibilities and said that there are no such things as uninvolved civilians in Gaza. He also called for the expulsion of Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. He said, quote, they can go to Ireland or deserts. The monsters in Gaza should find a solution by themselves, end quote. So he added that the Gaza Strip does not have the right to exist and that anyone waving a Hamas or Palestinian flag shouldn't continue living on the face of the earth. So in response to these comments, Netanyahu suspended Eliyahu from cabinet meetings. He resisted calls from opposition leader Yair Lapid to fire him. And Netanyahu said, quote, Minister Eliyahu's statements are not based in reality, end quote. And despite, again, the massive casualty rate in Gaza, Netanyahu is claiming that Israel is operating in accordance with international law to avoid harming innocents, but that's pretty tough to believe when you see what's actually happening. And besides how provocative this statement is, and really genocidal if he's calling to nuke the Gaza Strip, his comments also appear to confirm that Israel has nuclear weapons. So that's another thing that Netanyahu might not be happy about, because Israel does have a nuclear arsenal, but it has a policy of ambiguity and does not officially recognize that nuclear arsenal exists. But they're always going on about Iran, which does not have nuclear weapons. All right. So the next one here, largest Palestine protest in U.S. history shut down the streets of D.C. So this article is from Mondo Weiss. And it's estimated that 300,000 demonstrators shut down the streets of D.C. in the largest Palestine protest in United States history, calling for a ceasefire and an end to the genocide in Gaza. So this was on Saturday, and protesters gathered in Freedom Plaza, where organizers delivered speeches and led chants in support of Gaza before marching to the White House. So if you saw this over the weekend, there's lots of pictures here, and 300,000 sounds like a huge number, but it definitely looked like a lot. There was a lot of people. They surrounded the White House, and it goes to show that there's a lot of opposition to what Biden is doing, what Biden is supporting in Gaza. And so the U.S. finally broaches the idea of peace talks with Ukraine. So NBC News reported on Friday that U.S. and European officials have brought up the possibility of peace talks with Russia in conversations with the Ukrainian government. And this is a big shift. Because the U.S. and its allies had discouraged the idea of peace talks since Russia invaded in February 2022. This whole time, they've said no ceasefire, no negotiations. It's up to Ukraine, and we know Zelensky's not going to do it. So this is a big deal here. And this report said that the conversations have included a very broad outline of what Ukraine might need to give up to reach a deal. Some of the talks took place last month at a meeting of the Ukraine Defense Contact Group, and this is a grouping that has held meetings since Russia invaded Ukraine. It includes military representatives from about 50 countries. The talks about negotiations with Russia started due to Western concerns about the situation on the battlefield and the fact that it's becoming more difficult to keep funding the war. Former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, he recently said that he was playing a mediating role during some of these 2022 peace talks and that he believed no deal was reached because of the U.S. So he said he was mediating because Ukraine asked him to. He said, quote, "My impression, nothing could happen because everything else was decided in Washington. The Ukrainians did not agree to peace because they were not allowed to. They first had to ask the Americans about everything they discussed," end quote. So at the time, Russia's main demand for a peace deal was Ukrainian neutrality. There were some vague things about demilitarization, denazification that I think were up for interpretation, but the main thing was they wanted Ukraine to be neutral, and they weren't asking for territory. Of course, they would want them to recognize Crimea as Russian, but now, they've annexed all the territory that they control, and they have said quite a few times, the Kremlin has said that any future peace deal must recognize these territories as Russian. So Ukraine not only lost so many people since then, they're going to lose territory. Realistically, in any deal, they're not in any good position to negotiate.
Violence is wrong. Either you believe that or you don't. And if you believe all violence is wrong, then there's nothing to discuss except how do we bring about diplomacy and peace in all of the world's conflicts. Surely that at least should be sayable. But we're seeing politicians kicked out of their parties. We're seeing the word ceasefire being sort of essentially banned. Why is that? As I've continually said during this conflict, I am not in a position to condemn those who are inflamed, engulfed and lost in emotion as a result of the original horrific attacks in Israel or the ongoing military action right now and its obvious devastating consequences. I believe that if you are directly affected by that or you have an affinity with that, who can possibly deny your right to your feelings? What is interesting for all of us, and I would like you, regardless of your faith or creed or religion, to consider these perspectives, is people are making a lot of money out of this war. People are accruing a lot of power out of this war. People are being granted the ability to censor and cancel and possibly surveil and shut down as a result of this war. There are apparently plans to displace the entire Gazan population. That's something that's publicly understood now. Of course, the deployment of US troops is being discussed. Raytheon and Lockheed Martin are making significant profits. So we're living in a complicated time, there's no question. Things change in politics all the time, we all know that. But there's Joe Biden saying that one of his concerns about Trump is that Trump had the potential to bring about a war with Iran. So has a great deal changed? Have Iran changed a lot of their policies and positions in the interim? Or has something else changed? Let's have a look. In an interview with 60 Minutes earlier this month, President Joe Biden boasted of the United States' ability to fight multiple wars at the same time. Good for everyone, good for business. We're the United States of America, for God's sake.
We're the United States of America, for God's sake.
I've seen him say that. I think this is not a cogent argument for bringing about limitless death. The most powerful nation in the history of the world, he assured his interviewer. Again, jingoism and deracinated wild patriotism are unlikely to bring about solutions in such a complex set of conflicts. We can take care of both these wars, the war in the Middle East and Ukraine, and still maintain our overall international defense. We have the capacity to do this and we have an obligation to do it. We are the essential nation, to paraphrase the former Secretary of State, and if we don't, then who does? Do you ever wonder what America's political role in the world actually is? What is it that America are doing? You'll be familiar with both the maps of China surrounded by American military bases and now the map of Iran surrounded by American military bases. The assumption is that America is sort of somehow policing the world. And the story, I suppose, is that's to protect you from the rest of the world. The most optimistic argument, I suppose, we could make is that if America didn't occupy this position as a kind of global police force, then terrorists or the Chinese or Russians would take over your nation. But surely it would be possible to have a literal defense rather than attack industry or a defense policy that was about, if anyone does anything like they're coming near us or our interests, then we will prevent that from happening using military might. I suppose that immediately poses a bunch of questions. Are there American interests that are overseas? It seems like there are. Are these interests involving resources? It seems they might. Are there alliances with nations that ultimately amount to resource-based alliances or alliances of dominion? And does the American foreign policy really come down to an appetite for unipolar domination and global hegemony? Do you ever get enough time in your life to say, would it be possible to just have a different type of life where America wasn't agitating for and aggravating wars because it's somehow beneficial to the military-industrial complex? Mightn't it be better for us as ordinary Americans, just our neighbours and our homes and our day-to-day lives. I mean, you don't get time to ask those kind of questions, and certainly if you ask them out loud, you're likely to be silenced and shut down. So something very unusual is happening. Would you agree? Biden's string of American exceptionalist cliches has since been given a vintage election year chaser. What if more wars represents an invaluable economic opportunity? In an Oval Office address earlier this week, the president said just as much, dressing up new military spending in the language of economic nationalism and even name-dropping particular swing states where his advisors cynically expect the message to resonate. These wars have been cynically mobilized for economic and political purposes, literally in swing states. There could be more jobs in Arizona, so who do you want to vote for in the forthcoming election? That is not how such a complex and difficult situation should be handled. Do you not sometimes think that we are approaching a more and more dangerous scenario, and that the people in charge are not reliable, that they're not telling you the truth, that the agenda is not being explicitly stated, other than someone saying, look, it's this. Either we are able to dominate the world, or China are going to dominate the world, or Russia are going to dominate the world, or Islamic terrorists are going to dominate the world. You'd have to then evaluate whether or not that assessment was accurate, whether or not you trusted these people to carry out that operation, and whether or not they were being honest about the economic undergirdings of that argument, i.e. how are Raytheon, Lockheed Martin and the donor class benefiting from this situation. Until that's extracted, I don't think you can get a clear picture of what's happening. Whatever these wars are, it is not beneficial to ordinary Americans in their everyday lives. In fact, there's a strong argument that this will place ordinary Americans at risk, whether overseas and potentially even domestically, if it causes, as it seems that it will, an enormous refugee crisis, as apparently that is something that is well documented and understood, and WikiLeaks have revealed that that is part of the plan. There's not only a migration crisis, of course, but the likelihood that dispossessed, broken people across the world will find themselves in North America and European countries, and perhaps feeling that America and other nations did not have their interests at heart when it came to previous decisions. I mean, generally over the last few years, has the displacement of people and agitation of domestic populations in the Middle East been beneficial for Americans? Is the world a safer place post-Iraq? I mean, it took COVID to shut down ISIS. What is the real agenda that's driving American involvement in these global conflicts? Support was declining for continuing aid to Ukraine because of the failure of the counteroffensive, because there were obvious domestic problems, notably Hawaii, where American people felt their resources might be better directed. Let's have a look at how the defense industry really regards this type of conflict as opposed to what they say publicly. After Israel declared war in response to Hamas killing over 1,400 Israelis and taking around 200 hostages, the stocks of major American and European war profiteers soared, according to a report from Eyes on the Ties. 5 industry giants collectively recorded $195.6 billion in military-related revenue last year. They are Boeing, $30.8 billion, General Dynamics, $30.4 billion, Lockheed Martin, $69.3 billion, and Northrop Grumman, $32.4 billion, and RTX, formerly Raytheon, $39.6 billion. The top shareholders in these 5 defense companies largely consist of big asset managers or big banks with asset management wings that include BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, Fidelity, Capital Group, Wellington, JP Morgan, Chase, Morgan Stanley, Newport Trust Company, Longview Asset Management, Massachusetts Financial Services Company, Geode Capital, and Bank of America. Eyes on the Ties also highlighted how chief executives are handsomely compensated and the CEO's ties to big pharma, the fossil fuel industry, Wall Street, and foreign policy think tanks such as the Council on Foreign Relations and Center for Strategic and International Studies. During third quarter earnings calls this month, analysts from Morgan Stanley and TD Bank took note of this potential profit-making escalation in conflict and asked unusually blunt questions about the financial benefit of the war between Israel and Hamas.
You're listening to Part of the Problem on the Gas Digital Network.
Big thing that happened is a couple days ago there was a Time magazine piece written by the same guy who gave Zelensky the Person of the Year, which it really did mark, and you see this happen a lot in the media, in the establishment, corporate media, where you see there's a very weird dynamic, and we've all, I mean literally every single person listening to this show right now, me and you, we've all experienced this a lot, where there's this weird dynamic where there's a thing you've been saying for a while that is totally illegitimate to say. And you're a bad person if you say it. And everybody who knows anything and every single expert will tell you that is totally wrong and you're fucked up for saying this and you're not. And then all of a sudden, one day, it's just printed. And it's just okay to say it now. And now it's totally fine. I mean, the examples we could come up with this are countless, but like everything from like the vaccine doesn't actually stop the spread of COVID, or like
mass working.
Yes.
The virus coming out of the lab.
Yes, that's a great example. The virus, the lab leak theory, which at a time would literally get you banned off of all social media platforms. All of a sudden, it is just okay to say that. And then it's actually, yeah, that's probably what happened. And now everybody, even Fauci, like even guys like that who would have said, you're a horrible person for saying this, will now say, yeah, it's definitely a possibility. And we're looking into, So anyway, what happened with this Time magazine piece is now all of a sudden, the things we've been saying for quite a while you're allowed to say it. We've, just in the last few years, me and you have been ahead of several of these things. But what the piece was basically saying is that Ukraine can't possibly win the war, that they know that the war can't be won. All the Pentagon has, for the entire last year, they've been, what are you talking about? The counteroffensive's going great. Ukraine's going to win. We have to keep funding them because they're going to win. And now it's all of Zelensky's top people. They even called him delusional in the piece. And it was reported in this piece that the military is straight up ignoring orders. They're telling them to march forward and they're refusing. The generals on the ground are like, we're not going to do that because our military has been destroyed. And then there was an announcement just earlier today that that the Americans are pushing negotiations. So it seems like there's been kind of, as there are in these moments a lot, there's this drastic pivot toward there's never like an apology that comes along with it. There's never a recognition that we were wrong for smearing all the people who said this, but it does seem like there's a pivot to now kind of being like, okay, we're gonna move away from this war. We were joking on the live show the other day that America's like, look, you knew what this was, Ukraine, but this is my Israel's my wife. Like, you were just my side piece. But it is a pretty big. It's a big deal. This has been one of the biggest stories in the world for the last couple of years, and it's pretty crazy that just like this, they will once again get away with pivoting toward what we've been saying the whole time without any admission.
And a lot of people needlessly died. We basically just caused countless Ukrainian deaths for absolutely no payoff whatsoever. And for all the war hawkery of China, Taiwan, I mean, this must make it so much more likely that China goes, hey, I can get away with taking Taiwan.
It's there's certainly a strong argument to that. It's amazing how much of the war propaganda will just evaporate at this point. All of the things like, well, if Vladimir Putin gets Luhansk, then he takes Poland. And next thing you know, he's in Germany. Right. Is that a concern anymore? Or, like, let's be honest, everyone's going to drop that because they knew it was bullshit. And the crazy thing about it is that I remember, because I had a lot of debates about Ukraine. I did several of them. And I did a few Rogan appearances where I talked a lot about Ukraine. So I heard back from a lot of people. I got a lot of feedback off this thing. In fact, the biggest video clip I've ever done was off the war in Ukraine. Like, it went more viral than anything I've ever done. And it's amazing how much people, like real people, not like, people who are like being paid by Raytheon. I mean, just like real people will repeat the things they've heard from the corporate press to you. Like, they will genuinely tell you, like as if they believe it, that no, but if he wins in Ukraine, then Vladimir Putin is going to reconstitute the Soviet Union and he's going to move into Poland. And then we've got a war with NATO and all of these problems. And it's just interesting in this moment to see. It's like, dude, like you, real person who's arguing that. Look, they don't even believe this because if they did, at least one of them would be like, okay, we got to stop funding this war in Ukraine, but the real concern here is what we told you the concern was this whole time.
Right.
But you won't hear a word about that because no one's actually concerned. No one's actually thinks that Vladimir Putin is going to move into Poland next. And so, anyway, it's just like, you'd hope at least for some of those people, you're like, look, even they know this is bullshit. You're repeating the propaganda that these people will just abandon the second it's unpopular.
Yeah, that's when hopefully people actually go after them at the debates. Like, do you know that your policy is responsible for X amount of Ukrainian deaths? Do you know that the region will never recover? Like, you know what I mean? That's where you really have to go after these people. Your policy caused the following harm. What was the payoff?
It's such a good point because, look, I mean, we were simultaneously discouraging negotiations as of a year and a half ago. And on top of that, we were funding the war, giving them a blank check. So if Vladimir Putin ends up getting whatever he wants now, which is what clearly is going to happen, all we did was prolong the war for no benefit.
Yeah, how much money did we spend? How much death was there? And then where's the accountability? Unless Putin ends up invading and taking all of Europe, and you and I were wrong this whole fucking time, and we got to eat crow, how many people are going to be fired for the deaths and money lost on what was just a failed philosophy? It wasn't true.
Yeah.
Like, how many times can we keep taking actions on things that they say is absolutes, and then you turn around, they're unequivocally false, and everyone just gets to keep their job, and just the whole system, it just moves on. It drives me nuts.
Well, there was, we had on our last episode that we did before we left on this trip, we did the segment on Bill Maher's show.
Right.
And that clip, shout out to Chief Nerd, who's fucking, I love that guy. He promotes the fuck out of our shit. Great Twitter follow, by the way. If you're not following him, go check him out. But he shared that clip, so that clip went pretty viral too. But it was the thing. One of the things that was really incredible about that was just this moment, and I think the reason why it went viral and the reason why that clip, what we did, like kind of resonated with people, was because it is unbelievable where no matter how right we are. And when I say we, I don't mean to take like the credit from me and you. I'm speaking broadly of us, the people listening. Rob, I'm talking about Rob, only Rob. But you know what I mean? Like, no matter how correct all these dissident voices are and how wrong the regime gets it, no matter what, there's always this kind, because we were talking about it earlier. Like, there'll be something like, well, the fact that we took a stand there is the reason why Putin didn't invade Poland, right? They'll have some way to spin it. But what was crazy about that clip on Bill Maher's show is that even then, even when they had no way to spin it, When they had, he's just like, look, I was on a school board and I was arguing for school closures, and that turns out to be completely wrong. But, it's these people who are just trying to get their Twitter likes by making us all look bad. We were working with imperfect information, and the noble people at the CDC were doing the best they could, and that gets a round of applause. So it's like, even when they're just admitting we got it all wrong, they still somehow try to spin it in a way where it's like, but you're the jerk. So that's what's going to happen with this. That's what happens every single time.
Imperfect intelligence. We had imperfect intelligence when we said that Putin was going to go take all of Europe. Well, you cost 100,000 lives for imperfect intelligence.
One of the ways that Hamilton helped build this kind of unlimited federal power reservoir was through this doctrine of implied powers. Now, during the ratification debates, he had a completely different approach on how you were going to read the Constitution. And here from Mike Meharry, even Hamilton took up the limited federal power banner, writing this in Federalist 32. The state governments, quote, would clearly retain all rights of sovereignty which they before had and which were not by that act exclusively delegated to the United States. So the central government or the general government, according to Hamilton, before ratification, was not going to have unlimited power. It was going to be very much limited by those things that were exclusively delegated. But Meharry points out that it didn't take Hamilton long to change his tune. Less than 3 years after the ratification of the Constitution, Hamilton discovered implied powers hidden in the Constitution to justify Congress chartering the first bank of the United States. So Hamilton wanted a national bank. We have another version of that national bank, much worse, today, and the basis for it was implied powers that he discovered a few years after ratification, after he said there wasn't going to be any applied powers. Opponents of the bank, Mike writes, including Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, argued that the lack of specific delegated authority barred Congress from chartering a bank. So they didn't see it, and I don't see it in there either. You don't see anything in the Constitution that authorizes them to do this, but Hamilton then made the case that, of course, well, there are other powers other than what's been delegated. Even though I told you in the New York Ratifying Convention that whatever is not expressly delegated to the federal head is reserved to the members. That's what he said in July of 1788. Suddenly now it's a different take. He said it is not denied. So this is just indisputable truth, according to Hamilton in 1791, that there are implied as well as express powers, and that the former are as effectually delegated as the latter. And for the sake of accuracy, it shall be mentioned that there is another class of powers which may be properly denominated resting powers. He's got all kinds of powers. Suddenly they're going to have all kinds of powers because he wanted them to be able to do things that they weren't authorized to do. Now, mind you, I mentioned this in Friday's episode as well, that even though New York, when they sent him to the Philadelphia Convention, they sent him with express instructions that he was not allowed to do anything beyond proposing amendments to the Articles of Confederation. So the fact that he disregarded, now, of course, there's an argument to be made that he wasn't proposing anything. He was just talking about a plan. That was his take on this. And of course, people who want to violate the rules given to them always have a convenient excuse as to why they can get away with it, and they're not breaking the rules. And that's exactly what he did in the Philadelphia Convention as well. One of the ways to get unlimited power is to suddenly have implied powers. Patrick Henry warned us that allowing them implied powers meant we'd have 10,000 of them, and it's probably closer to 30,000 or more. So he even underestimated how bad it could get. And number three, another one of the ways that Hamilton helped give us this near or total unlimited federal power was by redefining words. And I think the most important one that he used was the word necessary. He redefined the meaning of the word necessary in his arguments in support of that national bank in 1791. Now, when the Constitution was ratified, the word necessary meant, well, necessary. But Hamilton didn't like that. Here's how he put it. It is essential to the being of the national government that so, mind you, he says the national government. He doesn't say federal government because his goal was a national one-size-fits-all. And if you listen to Friday's episode or watch that one, you'll see that he didn't even want states. He was very clear in saying the only reason he didn't really propose totally getting rid of them is because he recognized that would be a shock to the public. So he is like, how can we kind of get around these pesky states and create a one-size-fits-all national government while keeping them kind of in place? And he gave a whole proposal for how to do that. And so here he is talking about it again, even after ratification, even after he didn't get what he wanted, he still pushes for it anyways. And that's a real manipulator, some kind of a socio, I guess. It is essential to the being of the national government, Hamilton wrote, that so erroneous a conception of the meaning of the word necessary should be exploded. You got to absolutely smash the idea that the word necessary means necessary. It sounds like what we live under today. The idea, it's so Orwellian. War is peace. I mean, the idea that you can just change what a word means in order to justify more government power is not something new. Hamilton was all about that. He said, it is certain that neither the grammatical nor popular sense of the term requires that construction. According to both, necessary often means something other than necessary. He said, according to both, necessary often means no more than needful, requisite, incidental, useful or conducive to. I mean, I have never used the word necessary in that way. It's necessary for you to finish your homework. Doesn't mean, well, it'd be useful or helpful to do it. It's just not how people use it. So he's absolutely lying here. In that speech or in that paper, he actually used the word convenient or convenience almost a dozen times. So he was using this over and over and over. And then even though, well, Aaron Burr took care of him, I mean, not a lot of people were fans of Aaron Burr either. So even though that ended up going down, Hamilton's necessary means convenient stuck around. Of course, we had the First National Bank that led to much more, but Chief Justice John Marshall, some years later in the case of McCulloch versus Maryland, he adopted in some places, word for word, the Hamiltonian approach, the Hamiltonian definition. James Madison criticized this in a letter to Spencer Roane in 1819 in September. We'll link to this in the show notes. He basically wrote, and I'll read it here in just a moment, he basically said that the Constitution, the people who were considering ratification, never would have supported ratification had this been the commonly understood use of the word necessary. If the people who are, especially if we're thinking about places like New York and Massachusetts, it was barely ratified. Same with Virginia, it was also very close. New York, very close. The idea that some people that were kind of on the margins there would have said no had they been told that the word necessary meant, well, just convenient to government power. I think it's hard to argue against James Madison there that they probably would have lost and we wouldn't have had the Constitution. So it was a matter of presenting one case beforehand, lying about it really, and then flipping the switch later when you wanted to twist things around to expand power. And that's basically what we get with the Hamiltonian system, and that's really how most politicians act today.
You know, I lost a lot of confidence, as some people would realize, that something big happened in the 60s when our law enforcement agencies started assassinating our political leaders, and things have not been quite right since.
Yeah, that's for sure. Well, you know, you talk about them not wanting Trump to be a candidate. Well, something else was happening when this poll came out. Something very interesting happened in the Democratic Party. Dr. Paul, put up this next one. Now, this is David Axelrod. He is considered the architect behind the Obama victories. He said, only Joe Biden can make this decision. If he continues to run, he will be the nominee of the Democratic Party. What he needs to decide is whether this is wise, whether it's in his best interest or the country's. That is a very strong, delicately worded, but very specific way of saying, listen, guy, you need to get out. And if you need someone who's a little less nuanced, we'll go to the next one. Here's Bill Kristol, who tweeted after this came out. He said, it's time. President Biden has served our country well. I'm confident he'll do so for the next year. But it's time for him to act for an act of personal sacrifice and public spirit. It's time to pass the torch to the next generation. It's time for Biden to announce he won't run in 2024. These are very dramatic comments from people who are big Biden supporters.
The question I've had, and I've mentioned to you, is who really pulls the strings? Because the president and the vice president, I don't think anybody in this country believe they really know what's going on, or that they have an influence and they command respect on the international stage. I mean, that doesn't happen. But somebody's pulling it.
Well, this is what he points out. This and other organized attack on our former president are paid for by George Soros's web of charities, along with the Citizens for Ethics crew, which is a 501c3 involved in political witch hunts. The group even boasted about it on X, formerly Twitter. They said, we just sued to enforce the 14th Amendment and keep Donald Trump off the ballot in Colorado. So that's what's happening. And at the end of the day, that's going to be their nuclear option, I think.
And that'll just give more support for Trump.
Yeah,
Who ever heard of in America that they take your enemy and you charge him with silly crimes that they can't prove subjectively? But he's an insurrectionist, isn't he? Was he tried for that?
Not even charged, yeah.
Oh, we forgot to charge him, so we couldn't try him.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really crazy. But there was one incident that I wasn't too proud of with our government, our party, and Trump. But nobody said anything. Essentially, his opposition didn't call attention to it, and the Republicans didn't seem to care. And that was the assassination of Soleimani.
Yeah.
And if you talk about diplomacy and all, but it went by, and that to me is really sad, because that's how you take borderline friendships with some countries. You might as well destroy it.
Yeah.
Look at how often we do some things and we sort of get along with somebody, then we turn around and say, oh yeah, they did this, we have to put on sanctions and not let them freeze their assets and all that kind of stuff, just looking for trouble. But we're hamstrung because if we do too much of that, then we don't love America.
Yeah.
But maybe the people who care about justice and the Constitution, maybe there's a love of America there they don't have any understanding of.
Well, here's some people that I think don't love America, and probably for good reason. And I think this image is iconic. If you can put this next one up. This is our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, over the weekend. going in a secret trip to Baghdad. He was over there already. He takes a secret, he lands in Baghdad, and here he is in the cover of Night with a bulletproof vest on. And this commentator who posted it, it's been posted everywhere, but he makes a good point. Trillions of dollars in Iraq, 2 decades of war, thousands of American lives lost, thousands more injured, and this is how Secretary Blinken has to arrive in Baghdad, home of the largest U.S. embassy in the world. And you've commented on that embassy. Here he's going, the largest embassy. Remember, we were told they were going to greet us as liberators. Does that look to you, Dr. Paul, like he's being greeted as a liberator? It's amazing.
You know, nothing has stopped our protection of our empire. You know, when you look at what's going on in Syria and Iraq and at the various countries over there, what you're just talking about is, yeah, we really didn't have a victory in Iraq. We don't own Iraq. We're not even good at maintaining an empire because it's so wrong for us. But we've been continuing to bomb. You know, look how much involvement we've had in Ukraine, but Syria too.
Oh yeah.
But we own a third of Syria, and we have to protect our oil and all this stuff. That's unfortunately doesn't get much discussion in the debates. Maybe somebody will try to bring it up, but that's not in the cards most likely on what's going on there.
Biden is getting shellacked in the polls over his handling of Israel-Gaza thing. His own party is furious. There are breaks in the Democratic Party that we have not seen. Massive protests, 100,000 people in Washington, D.C. over the weekend protesting, and a lot of these people I think are Democrat voters. So he goes over to Netanyahu and says, hey, Bibi, I need a favor, man. I need you just to pause for a while. My boss is getting creamed over here. I need a little bit of help. Put on this next clip because this would be like if a picture tells 1,000 stories. Here, look at him. Look at the look on Blinken's face and look at Bibi. He's like, come on, Bibi. Can you just stop, pause for a second? We got that 14 billion coming, man. It's going to be great. Can you pause and then go to the next one? Bibi says, nah. He says, right after Blinken left, Israel will keep bombarding Gaza with all of its power. Netanyahu says after Blinken calls for a pause. And can you imagine, Dr. Paul, you were going there with $14 billion in your pocket you're going to give a guy, and you ask him for a little favor, and the guy says, take a hike, go pound sand. You know,
where they are now is a total lack of realism. It's almost like the lack of realism and understanding how our president and our vice president should give us some assurances that they're dealing with protecting our freedoms. You know, everybody's concerned about. But when you look at that, Netanyahu, he's not very popular over there.
No.
They say, no, we're not going to get rid of him until we win the war.
Yeah.
That sort of thing. So they're not realistic.
To add insult to injury, Blinken comes over there, hat in hand, please stop bombing. Netanyahu says, no, forget you. And what does he do the very next day? Put on that next clip. He bombs a convoy of ambulances in Gaza. Put on this clip, you can see the bodies under the, don't look too closely, but this is a tweet by the Doctors Without Borders, that's the international humanitarian group. And they said, this is Dr. Obeid, he's a Médecins Sans Frontières doctor at the Al-Shifa hospital. He says, we're standing inside the hospital gate when the ambulance was directly hit in front of us. There were bloody bodies everywhere. Many were killed immediately, while we rushed others to the operating room for emergency care. These are doctors who volunteer in war zones.
Declaration of Individual Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all who possess liberty are morally right to exercise their liberty, so long as they do not unjustly infringe on another's liberty. That which each individual gains peacefully is their property, and they are morally right to use or trade it, and that nobody has a right to take it from them, including the government. That each individual may pursue their own happiness, but that nobody may be forced to make anyone else happy. In order to secure rights like these and others, governments are instituted among people, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form, as to them shall seem most likely to effect their freedom and happiness. Governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly all experience hath shewn, that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty, to throw off such government, and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these United States, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their Systems of government. The history of the present federal government is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of a subtle yet pervasive tyranny over these states, as well as many abuses inflicted on foreign peoples. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world.
Don't worry, it's not foreign aid, it's corporate welfare. Faced with growing American frustration over more than $100 billion spent on a failed proxy war in Ukraine, President Biden's handlers have hit on a gimmick to convince us that this foreign aid is actually an investment in our own economy. In his recent television address, Biden explained that as we transfer more weapons to Ukraine, we then will build new weapons at home to replace them. That, explained Biden, means more American jobs and a stronger American economy. So Project Ukraine is not really about foreign welfare, but rather domestic corporate welfare for the military-industrial complex. Should that make us feel any better? There is no denying that this nearly 2-year Ukraine-Russian war has been a boon for the U.S. weapons industry. Profits at the military-industrial complex are back to record highs after a brief slump during the COVID scare. And the money that goes to the weapons manufacturers also saturates Washington, D.C. A little bit goes to the think tanks promoting war, another little bit goes to the political campaigns of candidates who promote war, and so on. As Connor O'Keefe reminds us in a recent article at the Mises Institute, the arguments that more war spending is good for the economy ignore the broken window fallacy, as first explained by French economist Frédéric Bastiat in his essay, That Which Is Seen and That Which Is Not Seen. In the tale, a shopkeeper has a window broken and must pay to have it replaced. The locals view the mishap favorably as they see the $50 for a new window to be a benefit to the glazier, which he will then spend, thus improving the economy as a whole. What is not seen, however, is what the shopkeeper might have done with that same $50 had he not been forced to replace a broken window. Perhaps he would have invested it in a way that created far more wealth and more jobs. Unfortunately, Biden is not alone in coming up with new gimmicks to enable Washington to operate in a business-as-usual manner. New House Speaker Mike Johnson has also been trying to convince us that sending money overseas is actually good for our own economy. Over the weekend, he appeared on Fox News to tell us that sending another $14 billion to the wealthy nation of Israel is Republicans trying to be good stewards of the taxpayers' resources. How's that? Well, he came up with the gimmick that they would cut $14 billion from the IRS and send it to Israel, said Johnson. Instead of printing new dollars or borrowing it from another nation to send over to fulfill our obligations and help our ally, we want to pay for it. What a concept. We are trying to change how Washington works? See the trick here. They are not paying for it by sending the money overseas, and they are not changing how Washington works by doing the exact same thing they always do, stealing from the poor at home to send to the rich in foreign countries. Instead of trying to trick Americans into thinking that foreign aid and corporate welfare are good for our economy, why not just stop breaking up all our windows? Just end all the foreign aid and corporate welfare. Thanks for listening.
So Gaza's health ministry said Monday that after 31 days of relentless Israeli airstrikes, the death toll in the besieged enclave has surpassed 10,000. And that total includes over 4,000 children. And the UN actually said on Monday that about 2,260 people in Gaza have been reported missing, and they're presumed to be stuck under the rubble, either alive or dead. And that number includes 1,270 children. So over 1,000 children under the rubble, potentially under the rubble. I mean, it's a really horrific thing to think about. The Israeli newspaper Yediot Aharonot cited an Israeli security source who actually put the death toll much higher. So this is interesting. And again, this is an Israeli official speaking anonymously to this newspaper, but I thought this was significant enough to include. This official said that he believes the Israeli military has actually killed 20,000 Palestinians in Gaza. So far, I haven't seen that number backed up by another source, but I thought it was worth mentioning. So the U.S. has nothing to show for its calls for a temporary pause in Israel's onslaught on Gaza, as the Israeli military says that it's cut off North Gaza from the south and a new phase of heavy ground fighting is expected. So Secretary of State Antony Blinken was rebuffed when he visited Israel on Friday and called for a humanitarian pause. President Biden spoke with Netanyahu on Monday, and the White House said that he discussed the idea of a tactical pause, but there's no sign that Netanyahu agreed or is even thinking about doing something like that. So White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby said that the U.S. was at the beginning of the conversation with Israel related to this idea of a pause. He said, quote, "So you can expect that we're going to continue to advocate for a temporary, localized pauses in the fighting," end quote. So temporary, localized pauses. So that might just mean, stopping airstrikes in a certain area at a certain time to get more aid in that area or to get people out. But again, they're not using the C word, which is ceasefire. So if you're watching here, you could see the map from South Front of the situation on the battlefield in Gaza, and Israel has separated North Gaza, which includes Gaza City, from the rest of the enclave, and they're saying that they're going to go into Gaza City. Now, that is going to be, there's probably very heavy fighting already happening on the ground. It's not really clear. There's not too many reports about what's actually happening on the ground, but if Israeli ground troops really push into Gaza City, they're going to face very stiff resistance from Hamas and Islamic Jihad and the other militant groups. It's going to be a serious fight, and it looks like they are moving in that direction, but still, it doesn't seem like quite yet they're going to be entering the city, but they're saying they're still, really hitting the city with airstrikes. Some reports I saw from Monday said that people were describing the airstrikes that day as some of the heaviest yet. So that's what I guess they're still trying to do, is soften it up with the airstrikes, even though the rubble can create, more hiding spots and things. And you have Hamas, they have those deep tunnels. So it's just going to be a very tough fight for the Israelis once they actually go in there. U.S. military announced on Sunday that a U.S. nuclear-powered submarine was in the Middle East in the latest provocation aimed at warning regional actors against attacking Israel or U.S. forces. So U.S. Central Command said that an Ohio-class submarine entered the region without offering any details. A U.S. Navy spokesperson later told Business Insider that the submarine was a guided missile submarine, which can carry 154 Tomahawk missiles. So it's got a lot of firepower, but it is not a ballistic missile submarine, and those are the ones that are armed with nuclear warheads. But still provocative nonetheless, and this submarine just represents another one of these deployments. And the thing about the submarines is that they're designed to be stealthy. The whole idea of them is that they could be they patrol waters all over the world, but nobody knows where they are, and they have very long-range missiles, especially the ballistic missile submarines. So they can hit targets from thousands of miles away. The only reason to announce where they are is if you want to say, hey, look it up. If you want to send a threat, if you want to, send a threatening message. So that's what the U.S. is doing here. Just like Biden recently docked a nuclear-armed submarine in South Korea. And that was the first time the U.S. has done that since the 1980s. And the only purpose of that was to say, hey, look, North Korea. Hey, look, China. We have nukes here. Just an insane provocation, for no other reason. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. So Zelensky explained that he is opposed to holding elections in 2024. The Ukrainian leader claimed that his government would be unable to hold elections due to the ongoing war. So Zelensky was elected to a 5-year term in 2019, and Ukraine is due to hold its next presidential election next year. Ukraine has been under martial law since Russia invaded in February 2022, and according to Ukraine's constitution, Ukrainian law prohibits elections during martial law. But Zelensky has actually previously said, if you give us enough money, we'll hold elections. He was saying he wanted the West to fund the elections. So it showed that there is flexibility when it comes to the law. But now he's basically saying, no, we're not going to have elections. He said, quote, "We all understand that now in wartime, when there are many challenges, it is utterly irresponsible to engage in topics related to an election in such a frivolous manner. We need to recognize that this is a time for defense, a time for battle, upon which the fate of the state and its people depend. I believe that elections are not appropriate at this time," end quote. So seems to be putting to bed the idea of holding an election.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
And so this was from the Wall Street Journal. We are not targeting Gaza's civilians on purpose. We have obligations to defend Israeli civilians. We're in a war with the aim that the brutal massacre of October 7th will never happen again, he said. And I feel like I keep hearing this argument of, well, our intended purpose is not to kill civilians. It's just not an excuse to me. Does that work to you guys? It's like, if the end result, you know exactly what it is, even if you want to claim it's not our intention for that to happen, if you know that that's exactly what's going to happen, well, then you're responsible for the outcome. I haven't quite figured out the joke yet. I haven't quite figured out the angle, but I'm just like, this is nonsense. Can you even define terrorism as not, our intention is not killing civilians, it's bringing world peace. That's what we're doing. When we engage in terrorism, our intended outcome is to crumble an empire by getting them into war, and so that the empire will fall and no longer be able to impose its evil will on other people. So our intended, while we would prefer not to have to kill civilians in order to bring about our version of world peace, we have no choice but to do it because we have no other way to fight an empire. I mean, can you explain away terrorism in the exact same way? We're not into killing civilians. That's not our intended. Well, and then you go, well, no, they are intentionally killing civilians in order to bring it about. It doesn't matter. You're still doing the exact same thing. To go, well, we're engaging war with these people with the intentions of ending the war and bringing peace. We have no choice but to kill the civilian. I don't even understand it. It's like a distinction that makes sense to these people that does not make sense to me at all. All right, let's continue with this. This is from, I believe, a different Wall Street Journal article. Israel's military said it targeted and killed a senior Hamas commander, along with dozens of other fighters in a vast underground tunnel complex that imploded beneath the collapsed building. Israel's military spokesperson, Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, said the commander, Ibrahim Biari, was a key player of the deadly October 7th attack in southern Israel, and Israel's bombs struck between buildings. We don't intend for the ground to collapse, he told reporters, but the issue is that Hamas built their tunnels there, and they're running their operations from there. I guess as long as it's not your intention, it's all about your intentions. They're very into like the spiritual over there and setting your intentions. And so, you know, if I rob someone and my intention is not to make them poorer, but just for me to be wealthier, then it wasn't my intention. The Jews, they're muting my microphone. All right, and now to give you guys a little bit more of the coverage of what's going on over there. This is the Biden administration has, for more than a week, called for a humanitarian pause that would enable aid to flow into the besieged territory and potentially facilitate the egress of foreign nationals and injured Palestinians. I think we need a pause, President Biden said. A humanitarian pause. That's the newest thing. Like Biden's just sitting around in the White House going, "Oh, time out, guys. You're killing a few too many of these people." What is a human? How do you take a humanitarian break, and then what? You get to go back to being inhumane? Like, guys, let's just have a moment of humanity here. Why don't we test that out? Why don't we just take a moment and see if, like, you know, guys, can we just have a weekend of humanity, and then you guys can return to being inhumane? I don't know how long I was muted for there before, but it's because I was making the best point I've ever made in my entire career. And so that's what happens sometimes when you make points that good, is you get muted. All right. Blinken tells Abbas he asked Israel to use smaller bombs on Gaza because everyone likes a compromise. You know, listen, we can't tell them not to kill people, but at least they, maybe with a little bit less of a splash, maybe they can use the smaller bombs when they're out there. That's what Blinken's out there doing in the Middle East right now. He's shaking hands with the Palestinians leaders, trying to, you know, de-escalate the situation. He's like, listen, I proposed a compromise of smaller bombs. We're going to work with the Israelis. We're going to try and take a humanitarian pause before they return to being inhumane. And then when they return to inhumane, maybe we can get them to use the smaller bombs. And then, of course, you know, while we're going, we don't support the killings of what's going on over there. What did we just approve? We just got a new funding bill for, let's see, the money, $14.3 billion. And that was money that could have been used to try and temper Putin's aggressions. Because, you know, now that this Israel thing's going on and we got to pour all of our money into the Middle East, we all now have to just live a world where Putin's going to be taking over all of Europe. Because remember, Ukraine was winning the war. Ukraine was doing great, right? They were winning the war. They just need a little bit more resources. But now that we need to fund what's going on in Israel, we're all just going to have to live with the fact that Putin's going to be taking over all of Europe. All right, and then this was from Vice President Kamala Harris. She was putting out this video talking about, today POTUS and I are announcing the country's first national strategy to counter Islamophobia. And why not just prevent our military partner from blowing up their buildings in Gaza? I mean, if we're concerned about that, why not make that the correction? All right, we got another brand new sponsor to the show. Look at this.
One thing you won't be deciding for yourself is whether or not to have a government in the United States of America that is not pro-war, because both the Republicans and Democrats are pro-Middle Eastern war, in particular with Iran. Now, Joe Biden, as you know, is already discussing ground troops in Gaza. And curiously, the idea of ceasefire or peace is now verboten, even to discuss it. Now, if you're a person that is affiliated with Palestine, I imagine you have extremely strong opinions about what's happening there now. And if you're a person with strong affiliations with Israel or Judaism or Islam and Palestine, there's so many ways for you to be personally offended and affected by this. But I would say for the rest of us, perhaps what we could look at is peace, ceasefire, solutions, ways of ending this. Again, I can understand if you are Israeli and you're like, well, we can't possibly because Hamas wants to execute everyone. Or if you're Palestinian, this is unfair, they're carpet bombing. All of those things. How can I, a man from Grays, Essex, England, possibly pontificate on that? But I tell you what we can talk about is whether or not it's best for the West and America in particular to unilaterally fund the perpetuation of wars between Russia and Ukraine, potential wars with China, war with Iran. Surely there must be a conversation about what is best for humanity as a whole, for the individual people across various regions. How come these arguments continue to collide and contradict? Why is it that it's impossible to say, wow, man, we should be evolving beyond this whole war state that we appear to be globalizing right now? What's difficult to engage these kind of subjects? So easy to go for the emotional response. I'm on this side, I'm on that side, I'll post these kind of things. But I feel like we might need to look for a third way. This is Daniel Ardepetris, who's a fellow at Defence Priorities. As bad as the war between Israel and Hamas is, it could get even worse if the fighting expanded. Some US politicians and pundits are perfectly fine with the prospect and even recommended that the Biden administration take the fight directly to Iran, Hamas's main external backer. Senator Lindsey Graham, an arch-Iran hawk, has used several television appearances to press for war against Iran. On October the 15th, the senator stated the US should knock Iran out of the oil business if Hezbollah, its proxy in southern Lebanon, entered the conflict. Pundits are wholly unaccountable and have the luxury of not worrying about the consequences of their recommendations. Policymakers, in contrast, have weighty responsibility on their shoulders and need to closely weigh the costs and benefits of every plausible scenario. And I suppose here it becomes relevant and important to note that it's our firm belief that those policymakers do not represent you. They represent another set of interests and have to create rhetorical veils to prevent us going, hey, you don't represent us. You're just going to do stuff that's convenient for your backers. That's why you invest in weapons companies on the precipice of war. That's why you accept donations. That's why you turn up at these dinners. That's why lobbying and donations aren't all banned. So because we're not thinking in those terms for some strange reason, we allow policies to be made that are at odds with the interests of most of us. Unlike the rocket arsenals of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hezbollah's missile capacity includes at least some with precision-guided technology. Casualties in Israel would be immense. Taking the fight to Iran is the last thing US should do. It was a terrible idea when it was proposed in the past, and it's a terrible idea now. And it seems like it's the sort of idea that would only be pursued by people who don't care about Palestinian lives, Israeli lives, Iranian lives, American lives, British, French, Syrian, Yemeni lives, perhaps even life itself, outside of a very narrow set of parameters and a very narrow set of interests. Whatever such a unipolar and hegemonic perspective is, it is not advanced, it's not fair and just, it's not likely to lead to a better, more peaceful world. Think how at odds that assessment is with Joe Biden's almost ludicrously jingoistic proclamations on 60 Minutes. We're the United States of America, for crying out loud. We're America. I hear what you're saying, but what about the sort of escalation because of the accessibility of these precision missiles? America? Those three syllables are not going to be sufficient to help the people of Tel Aviv in the event that Hezbollah target them, which in this analysis becomes a possibility. And the heightened emotions caused by an appalling terror attack and an escalating ground war in a region that has been historically more troubled than any that I can even think of. All of these things have to be considered. And to be dismissive of the very idea of peace, or looking for a solution, or not immediately alloying yourself unquestioningly to one side, because one side has historically been oppressed and the other side has been subject to genocide. And there are so many religious reasons that either side can call upon. Otherwise, this conflict wouldn't be happening, I suppose. That if we allow politicians, policymakers, weapons manufacturers, global hegemonists, the kind of unipolar forces that exploited the pandemic in order to create profit, and if those voices prevail, if there isn't the introduction of nuance, conversation, uncertainty, doubt, inquiry, without those things, without the kind of Sturm and Drang and patriotism and bluster and simplistic online alliances that appear to define almost every issue these days, then the outcome is likely to be global war. It was already worrying that people were not advocating for peace between Ukraine and Russia because it's a situation that would inevitably lead to a nuclear conflict. Finding ways to mesh that together with this far more volatile situation in the Middle East is appalling and ridiculous. I don't think we should be afraid to advocate for peace. And if there are no political parties, if the Democrat Party want war because their interests are the military-industrial complex interests, if the Republican Party want war because their interests are the military-industrial complex's interests, or energy companies, or whatever kind of alliances they have, you know as well as I do, whatever it is they're saying and whatever it is they're doing, it isn't because we love the people of this region or we love the people of that religion. They don't care about that. You might really care about it. They don't. It's clear from their actions, from the events of the last few years, and the direction of flow of revenue, and what kind of people find themselves unpersoned or Belmarshed into eternal, trialless purgatory. I'm speaking, of course, of Julian Assange. That tells you what the trajectory of power is. And if this happens to align temporarily with your belief system, then I won't judge you. But if you're not personally, religiously, ethnically involved in this conflict, then I would say, and I pray that you agree with me, that we should be looking for ways to avoid the loss of human life, avoid damaging the planet, and avoid our shared and collective future. Because from the most desirable perspective, we do have a shared future. And if we abandon that perspective and just say, no, it's this tribe and that tribe and you're either with us or against us, and even if you just don't ally yourself to one of these perspectives, you're out, then it's over. It's really, really actually over. And then we will have a regionalized, tribalized world because civilization will crumble as a result of escalating conflicts that will ultimately become nuclear, I suppose. I mean, that's certainly one solution, and one that perhaps we should be working together to avoid. Can we at least agree on that?
The Peter Schiff Show. This time, the report is weak from top to bottom. I mean, it's not just superficially strong, it's superficially weak, and then it's weak, even weaker when you get beneath the surface. So first of all, they were expecting 180,000 jobs created, which wasn't that many jobs considering some of the reports that we've gotten from previous numbers. So they were looking for 180,000, and we got 150,000. So it was a miss, but beneath the surface of that miss was an even bigger miss. First of all, in the private sector, only 99,000 jobs were created. These are private sector jobs. And that means that 51,000, or 34% of all the jobs that were created during the month were government jobs. The government hired 34% of the people who got jobs. Now, that is not strength. That is weakness. First of all, I've mentioned this in the past, but when the private sector creates a job, that doesn't cost you and I any money. I mean, it will if we buy the product or the service that that company is selling, because the wages of the workers are going to be embedded in those prices. But, we're still getting something for our money. We're buying something and, we're paying the cost. And of course, if you don't buy those goods or services, then you don't bear the cost of those workers. But when the government hires somebody, particularly the federal government, everybody is going to bear that burden. There is no profit-generating enterprise to absorb the costs. How does the government pay for new hires? Well, out of its tax revenue. Although now it's not out of tax revenue, it's out of new borrowing, because the government is borrowing all the money to pay these workers, which is going to mean higher interest rates and more inflation. In fact, if you go back, and I wrote this number down, since April of 2003, according to the government, 1.234 million jobs were created, but only 191 more people actually were working. How is that possible, right? How could you create 1.2 million jobs but only get 191 more workers? Because the jobs went to people who already had jobs. So we don't have new people in the workforce. We just have people in the workforce working more jobs. And again, I've explained in the past, that is a sign of weakness, not strength. The fact that people can no longer pay the bills with one job, the fact that you now need 2 or 3 jobs to cover the expenses that you used to cover with one job, that's not a strong labor market. That is a very weak labor market, because labor, the return on labor is collapsing. Workers can't earn enough money to pay the rent, to pay all their other bills. Let's go and talk about the Fed, because the Fed left interest rates unchanged as was expected, right? I mean, the Fed never wants to confound expectations. They never want to surprise the market. So if the markets expect no rate hike, well, they deliver no rate hike. And that's what happened. And, during his prepared remarks, before he took the Q&A, Powell once again talked about the economic hardships that inflation is creating. He acknowledges that. He always uses the word hardship. But what he doesn't understand, or at least he pretends he doesn't understand it, or he doesn't, and what the media doesn't seem to get, is since inflation is caused by the government and caused by the Federal Reserve, it's the government and the Fed that are creating that hardship. It's not like it's just happening out of left field, that, oh, this inflation came along and, oh my God, look at all the hardship. No. The government created this hardship because the government decided to tax everybody with inflation. Now, had they used another form of taxation, had the Biden administration, not the Trump administration for that matter, had they raised taxes enough to pay for all these government programs, that would have created hardship too. Families would be struggling under the burden of crushing taxation. So because the government decided to tax them through inflation as opposed to through the income tax or the payroll tax, the hardship that is being created is because of government, right? It's not just something that's happening by happenstance. And, oh, the government is running to the rescue because this horrible inflation has descended on us and is causing all this hardship. The government is the source of the hardship. Inflation is just the mechanism by which the government is delivering that hardship. Now, he also, again, he reiterated that the Fed's goal is price stability, that we're going to restore price stability. But no one ever says, why? What's so good about price stability? Why is that the goal? I mean, what about lower prices? Because price stability, the way a normal person would define it, is prices stay the same. Well, I'm a consumer. I'd rather have prices go down than prices remain the same. So what if prices went down 1% a year or 2% a year? Why is that so bad? Why does the Fed have to replace that with stability? Now, again, what the economists will tell you is, oh, that would be a disaster because people will stop consuming because nobody's going to buy anything if they think they can get it 1% cheaper next year, which is nonsense on its face. I mean, why am I the only one that actually, calls this BS out? I mean, think about it. Let's take food, for example. Let's say you think that the price of food is going to be 1 or 2% cheaper next year. Are you going to wait? Are you going to starve yourself while you're waiting for food prices to come down 1 or 2%? No, you're going to eat when you're hungry and you're going to pay whatever the price is. Now, as a consumer, if somebody asks me, hey, Peter, when you buy your food next year, would you rather it be 1 or 2% cheaper or 1 or 2% more expensive? Well, I'd rather it be cheaper. Of course. I'd always rather buy stuff for less money because, if my food was cheaper, I'd have more money left over to buy something else. But if food goes up in price, well, then I can't buy something else because I got to spend that money on food. So we don't really need price stability. It's kind of a BS goal. But we don't even have a goal of price stability because the way the Fed defines price stability is prices that go up every year by 2%. Well, there's nothing stable about that other than the rate of increase, but something is not stable if it's going up. So the Fed says that its mission is that the cost of living go up 2% every year. So they don't want stable prices. They want prices that rise in a predictable manner. And what Powell admitted was that we're nowhere near our goal. He said, inflation is way above our 2% target, and there's a long way to go before we can get inflation back down to 2%, right? So and he's been saying that, but even though we're down to whatever 3.5, he's still saying it's a long process. It's going to take a long time, and he's underestimating it. Waiting for inflation to go to 2% is going to be like waiting for Godot. It's never going to happen. And in fact, as I said earlier, based on what I'm seeing in the foreign exchange markets, we've already bottomed in inflation, and we're heading up.
Continuing on the Blinken Smackdown tour was his trip to Israel, because he goes over there, he meets with Netanyahu. He says, we talked about it yesterday, listen, Bibi, I need you to take a humanitarian pause on this bombing. You're killing way too many civilians. It's looking bad for us. Can you just kind of wait for a few minutes? And Netanyahu says, no, forget it. Take a hike. And so then Blinken comes back and says, well, and actually you can put up this next clip if you get over there. So then he says, he also says, we also know that Israel cannot reassume control and responsibility for Gaza. It's important to note that Israel has made it clear that it has no intention or desire to do that. And if you go forward, and then literally the next day Netanyahu says, we're going to control it indefinitely. So Blinken goes over there and says, Israel has no intention of controlling Gaza. Don't worry. The next day Netanyahu says, we're going to control Gaza. So he's literally he's literally almost invisible at these places he goes to.
And well, at least the clout of the United States is practically invisible. It's being diminished, and that's a heck of a way to get a plus. You know. But no, I think since we don't believe in empire, we don't believe in force and violence in order to bring about one's idea about what the world should be like. And if there is a struggle, it should be dealt with the people most involved. So if there's a struggle, matter of fact, in a way, it was much more independent under the Levant, where every country and the Jews and nobody wants to talk about it. But when it was government, because a lot of people lived in 4 or 5 different countries. The Jews lived there. There were Muslims living there, and people describe. It was so different.
Yeah.
There wasn't this antagonism. It's the globalist approach to government, and this was attempted and introduced. This whole thing was introduced way back in 1917. But then after World War II, we finally got our United Nations going. The United Nations, accelerated the conflict in the Middle East. It said, "Oh, we'll teach those Americans." And Truman says, yeah, this whole idea about declaring war, we don't need to do that. But the globalist approach to this and the invitation to get control of the international, organization has led to this. But because we had the seeds of an empire, we jumped at the opportunity. And you know what? If you ever said what I just said in public, what you are is you're un-American. You don't care. You don't care about real freedom. We're going to, because you guys would just lead to a lot of chaos and anarchy. Well, if you want to see anarchy, go visit San Francisco and L.A. and a couple other cities.
He went to Turkey. He wanted to meet with Erdogan. Put this next clip up. He wanted to meet with Erdogan. Go forward one. And this is Sprinter X on Twitter posted this from the Figaro, the big French conservative newspaper. Erdogan has closed his door on Blinken. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken had hoped in vain for a meeting with President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. As a result, he had to be content with communicating with Foreign Minister Fidan and fly away a few hours. So he rolls in. No one meets him at the airport. We talked about that yesterday. It's like the third in command of the public works services or whatever comes to meet him. He gets there. He wants to meet with President Erdogan. He says no. Erdogan is up there in Ankara hanging out. Doesn't want to meet with him. And in fact, Craig Murray, who was the British ambassador to Kyrgyzstan, I believe it was, he had a tweet on it. If you go to the next one about what happened, he recognized. He says, in terms of diplomatic practice, Turkey's decision not to greet Blinken at the airport and not to see him off there is a very strong rebuke. In 22 years as a diplomat, I never saw such a precedent. So that is incredible. I won't read the last part, sort of funny, but go to the next one. And here's it. While he was there, they were actively trolling him. Now here's a picture of him sitting with the foreign minister. Diplomatic insult. Turkey trolling U.S. Secretary Blinken during the visit. Ankara placed a replica of the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the table next to Blinken during his meeting with the Turkish foreign minister, forcing Blinken to have his photo taken next to it for all the world to see. That is so clearly symbolic, and you can see how awkward Blinken is looking sitting next to a replica of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So anyway, that kind of takes care of his trip to the Middle East.
That doesn't bode well for a good outcome.
Yeah. Iraqi prime minister meets with Iranian leadership and praises Hamas one day after meeting with Blinken. So go to the next one. So Blinken rolls into town. He has a little visit with the Iraqi prime minister and says, hey, here's what we need you guys to do. You got to crack down on these people shooting rockets into our bases. You gotta don't be so one-sided toward Iran. You gotta do all these things. And al-Sudani says, sure. The Iraqi prime minister says, sure, whatever. As soon as Blinken leaves, he calls up his buddies over in Iran and says, hey, let's get together. You're not going to believe what Blinken was trying to tell me to do. I mean, it's almost comical.
Yeah, the big question is, do they have a strategy? Yeah. And if they do, where's their brain? Which goes on and on. But the tragedy is that the world has gone through this type of thing many, many times, and it always ends badly most of the time. And that is that they just run out of people to kill, and they run out of ammunition. But now it's unique. They run out of ammunition, so they use up ours, and then we have to, replenish our weapons. At the same time, we're out of money, but it's the age of fiat. There's the biggest con job in the history of mankind has been the fiat ability of our dollar running the empire, which is coming to an end, and that's another thing that's thrown in there. And but it's also helping to wake up the American people. You know, they're saying, why are we doing this? And we have more and more of the conservative progressives saying, you know, how many more dollars do we have to send into Ukraine? And now we have resistance even to sending money to Israel for various reasons. And there will be a limit, but it won't be because people have become more moral. I think they're running out of the ability. They're running out of soldiers, and they're running out of money to buy weapons, and that doesn't guarantee peace, but it gives an opportunity. If that's what's happening, and they can't afford this war, we better start talking a lot more about understanding what non-intervention is. And they say, oh, that could lead to chaos. I think we have a little bit of chaos here now with interventionism.
Yeah.
We, the individuals of America, firmly believe in the principles of liberty, justice, peace, and self-governance. We declare our individual independence from an overbearing and intrusive federal government, recognizing that our rights are inherent, inalienable, and derived from our very nature. We assert these rights and exercise our liberty without unjustly infringing on the liberty of any other individual or group. In our understanding, liberty embodies the capacity to reason and act. It is a metaphysical essence inherent to all functioning individuals throughout history. Liberty exists outside the realms of ethics and politics, residing solely in the metaphysical realm. It does not prescribe any specific manner of reasoning or action. Rather, it acknowledges the presence of this exceptional quality within human beings. Rights, on the other hand, are moral constructs that find their foundation in the metaphysical concept of liberty. They represent the inherent, unalienable, and self-assertive moral principles that govern our interactions with one another. Each individual has the right to exercise their liberty, while it is inherently wrong for anyone to unjustly encroach upon the liberty of another. Rights encompass the entitlement of individuals to pursue their personal goals and happiness, safeguarded from unwarranted interference. Moreover, we affirm that each person is the rightful owner of themselves and the fruits of their labor attained through the peaceful exercise of their liberty. This encompasses property and other possessions acquired through voluntary exchanges and legitimate means. Rights strictly pertain to ethics and are devoid of any political connotations. Even if a nation were to deny a right, it would not transform that right into a wrong. Rights retain their inherent nature, irrespective of the world's misconceptions. Freedom, in contrast, is a political concept that rests upon the ethical foundation of rights, which, in turn, are constructed upon the metaphysical concept of liberty. Freedom is realized when society accurately identifies and acknowledges these rights, establishing a government whose primary function is to ensure justice by duly punishing any unjust violations of these rights through due process.
So President Biden asked Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to agree to pause Israel's assault on Gaza for 3 days to allow progress in Hamas releasing hostages. And this was reported by Axios on Tuesday. And this request was made in a phone call that took place on Monday. But Israel continues to rebuff U.S. calls for a humanitarian pause in Gaza. On Tuesday, Israeli President Isaac Herzog spoke with Vice President Kamala Harris, and he said that there would be no kind of ceasefire without Hamas releasing all of its hostages first. So according to this Axios report, the U.S., Israel, and Qatar have been discussing a proposal that would involve Hamas releasing 10 to 15 hostages and then using the 3-day pause in fighting to verify the names of the remaining captives and then deliver a list and say, this is who we have. Israel has said that a total of 240 people were captured during the October 7th attack, although Hamas is saying that 60 are missing due to Israeli airstrikes. So far, Hamas has released 4 hostages and says that it's ready to release 12 more foreign nationals, but can't because of the Israeli bombardment. So in the call on Monday, Netanyahu told Biden that he did not trust Hamas's intentions and that he didn't believe they would agree to a deal regarding hostages. He's basically saying, we're not going to negotiate with them. And he's also worried that if Israel pauses its brutal assault for 3 days, it will lose international support. It doesn't have much international support as it is, but I think Netanyahu is probably concerned that thinking this is his chance, the U.S. is still backing me, I just got to keep going, full steam ahead here. And again, while we have Biden suggesting things like this, the U.S. isn't using any of its leverage to get Israel to stop. That could change. Hopefully that changes. I mean, soon enough. But I think that's a big part of Netanyahu's calculations is right now they're not forcing me to stop, so we're just going to keep going. So in an interview with ABC News on Monday, Netanyahu said that he is open to little pauses, but not a ceasefire without the release of hostages first. And the Biden administration has refused to use the term ceasefire a 3-day pause in fighting. That sounds like a pause in fighting, pause in airstrikes. That sounds like a ceasefire to me, but they still aren't using that term. I think they're just afraid to use it because it might indicate that they don't want to keep backing the war. I think by not using it, they're making it clear that, they're not talking about ending the assault. They're just talking about putting it on pause for a bit and then restarting it after you get some more hostages out. So, but again, it doesn't seem like Netanyahu is going for that. So Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu envisions Israel taking overall security responsibility for the Gaza Strip indefinitely if the Israeli war to destroy Hamas is successful. And he said this in an interview that aired late Monday. So Netanyahu said, quote, "I think Israel will, for an indefinite period, will have overall security responsibility because we've seen what happens when we don't have it. When we don't have that security responsibility, what we have is the eruption of Hamas terror on a scale that we could not imagine," end quote. So what he's saying here is, for Israel to be in charge of security in Gaza indefinitely, that would mean, military occupation. Gaza was under Israeli military occupation for decades. They pulled their troops out in 2005 and then imposed the military blockade in 2007. So it's been under a brutal blockade since then. And it sounds like Netanyahu, if his war against Hamas is successful, he's not going to want to pull his troops out. And I do think the ultimate, what they really want, what Netanyahu and his party wants, is to annex the territory and kick all the Palestinians out. It's pretty clear. The question is if he's going to be able to do that. So when asked if John Kirby was asked if the U.S. would support Netanyahu's vision, and he said that they are still discussing the future of Gaza, of a post-war Gaza. One thing he said is that the U.S. does not. The U.S. position is that Hamas cannot be in control of Gaza anymore. He said, quote, "What we support is that Hamas can't be in control of Gaza anymore. We can't go back to October 6th. We are having conversations with our Israeli counterparts about what governance in Gaza should look like post-conflict. And I don't believe that any solutions have been settled upon one way or the other," end quote. So U.S. officials have said, and Kirby has said, that they don't want Israel to occupy Gaza after this war. But realistically, they're not putting any conditions on their support for Israel. So I just can't, if Israel does end up occupying Gaza, I just can't imagine the U.S. stopping them from doing it. So a top aide to Zelensky has said the West needs to keep backing Ukraine's war with Russia, and he hit back at comments made by Italy's prime minister about growing war fatigue. So this is Meloni, the Italian prime minister. She made these comments last week while on the phone with Russian pranksters who she thought were African Union officials. She said, quote, "There is a lot of fatigue. I have to say the truth from all sides. We are near the moment in which everybody understands that we need a way out," end quote. Again, she's talking about the war in Ukraine. So Andriy Yermak, who is the head of Zelensky's office, claimed that the West would be less safe if it stopped fueling the proxy war. He said, quote, "Even if there are people who feel this fatigue, I'm sure they don't want to wake up in a world tomorrow where there will be less freedom and less security, and the consequences of this last for decades," end quote. So kind of using the narrative that if Russia isn't stopped in Ukraine, they're going to march into Poland, into Eastern Europe, which is just a whole lot of nonsense. And Yermak's pushback comes amid mounting signs that Ukraine will struggle to maintain the support it needs from the U.S. and NATO to keep the war going.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
So, now you got the Ukraine war. Before this, it's out of the news. And I have warned over and over again, it's going to get back in the news. It's going to get back in the news. Oh, they just bombed Donbass today. The Ukrainians killed a bunch of people in Donbass, but that doesn't make the news. They're going to do an assault on a nuclear power plant, a major event against Russia somehow, some way, a false flag reel. They're going to get back in the news. Zelensky wants the money to keep the war going. It's totally out of the news. World War III has begun. We said it with the Ukraine war, COVID war, to Ukraine war, to World War. And in 3 years, this world has changed. The COVID war changed the world like we knew it. Then the Ukraine war, and now the Israeli war. The Israel war, Ukraine war, World War III has begun. Oh, and that guy Netanyahu, we only warn Trends Journal subscribers now since he got into power late last year, 1 week after another, running the articles about what the mainstream media called his extreme right-wing government, slaughtering Palestinians, bombing the mosques, stealing more land under the fucking bullshit name of settlers. They were ramping this up. When all else fails, they take you to war. People, I ask, they don't know dick about shit about the 39 weeks of protests going on in Israel that the Israelis called a civil war. Haaretz, the Jerusalem Post, the Times of Israel, and a number of Israeli officials. A civil war was going on there. Totally fucking forgotten. And most 99.999% of the people don't even know what's going on. When all else fails, they take you to war. And as you read in your Trends Journal, Biden pushes for 3-day pause from Israel. The U.S. president has reportedly suggested that a halt to fighting could help secure releases of some hostages by Hamas. A 3-day pause? How about stopping the fucking slaughter? 3-day pause. Oh, and an article that we have in here before about Biden? Yep, Biden tells Jewish rabbis no time for ceasefire. That's right. And this is the fucking bullshit. Again, what Hamas did, totally opposed to it. Disgusting. But this is what they keep reporting week after week after week after week after week. Was it the 5th week is going on? This is from the Jerusalem Post. Every fucking article. Israel at war. IDF deep in Gaza. Fighting resumes in north. And then they have 1,400 Israelis murdered since October 7th, including 345 soldiers, 241 held hostage by Hamas, 4 hostages released, 1 rescued. Every fucking day, they go back to what happened on October 7th. But nobody talks about what we printed in the Trends Journal week after week after week after week, month after month after month after month. Netanyahu and his government slaughtering Palestinians, stealing their land, bombing mosques, one after another. But this is all that counts. 1,400 dead. That's nothing compared to what you've been doing to the Palestinians. The markets. You ready? All right. Diesel demand is shrinking. Yep. Along with the manufacturing indexes in the United States and Europe. That's what you have to look at. You don't look at this fucking bullshit, GDP going up because you're spending more money in services and hospitalities. That's a lot of crap. Prices should be going way up right now. They're going down on gas and oil. West Texas just hit a low, like it's the lowest since July today. They're falling big because the global economy is slowing down big. The export numbers just came out from China, down 6.4% from the same time last year. 6.4%. And the 6th month in a row of declining exports. This is the Chinese that gave us the COVID war to celebrate Chinese Lunar New Year, the year of the rat, January 2020. And there are 3 years of zero COVID policy. The destruction it's done, again, the COVID war, the Ukraine war, and the Israel war. This is, you're worried about the economy. We may not be life on earth. We may be annihilated. Here, and talking about the damage it's done. This is from the New York Post yesterday. Full page, right? Lean streets. New York City's post-COVID recovery among worst. Foot traffic down 33%. 33% down. One after another, you look at the crap going on, what's going on in... there's a big story in Fox News today about all the businesses, the restaurants closing up in San Francisco and what a fucking slum hole it is. I left my heart in San Francisco, not anymore. I'm leaving San Francisco. Brought to you by scumbag, rotten fucking politicians. We're fighting the COVID war. Close down your business. Stay home. We'll tell you what to do. When you look at what's going on in the equity markets, it's a total fucking fraud. China's going down. Europe is in recession, the brink of. It's all that. Look at the manufacturing index numbers. This thing's going down. We said the markets would go down in September and October. They did. We said they would go up back last November. The S&P would go up over 16%, and it did. And now we're saying a crash is coming. But don't worry, when all else fails, they take you to war. Unless we, the people, fight for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Thank you.
dismantling of the FDA, then what's it going to take? Right, okay, how did this opioid crisis happen? Let's look at the facts. Let's speak to some key players here. Does anyone, for example, work at the FDA? Well, we'll speak to everyone that worked at the FDA. All right, what about people that worked at Purdue Pharma? We'll speak to all of them. They're the same people. Do you think that might be leading to this crisis? If the legacy media don't carry out an investigation over years, speaking to hundreds of people when the hundreds of thousands of deaths are taking place, do you think they might have a dog in the fight? Do you think they might have some skin in the game? Do you think that they might be part of the problem? Do you not see that the thing that's truly important about this pandemic is that it revealed absolute corruption of the state, big pharma, and the legacy media working together in total conjunction and lockstep to ensure that their agenda could be amplified and met without question, and that any independent media voices that dared to oppose it were shut down, whether that's Tucker Carlson, booted off of Fox, or whether it's Joe Rogan having his own stuff to deal with, or any other voices that you may have seen significantly attacked as a result of ongoing legacy media campaigns. How extraordinary. If they're so keen on investigations, where's that investigation? If the FDA can get away with this, then who's going to step in and regulate when it comes to the crisis that has apparently been brought about as a result of the pandemic? Who are you going to trust to ask the questions? The FDA is far from the only agency whose employees have moved on to higher paying private sector jobs for dubious reasons. Yeah. A recent study conducted by researchers at the University of Southern California and Harvard University reported that between 2004 and 2020, 54% of workers at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, remember from the legacy media, new things going to be improved, but oh my God, it's not just the FDA that has to improve it. That would be open to some kind of corruption. Then the CDC, they have to approve it. Who left the agency for another job, moved into the private health sector where workers can get higher salaries. 54% of their employees went into the private sector where they can get higher salaried jobs. This isn't even a condemnation of individuals. Who among us doesn't want to earn more money for our families or to survive in this crazy topsy-turvy world? But this is an issue that affects hundreds of thousands, well in the case of this, billions of lives, and it was totally corruptible and totally corrupted. Craig Holman, the government affairs lobbyist for the consumer watchdog group Public Citizens, said, "The revolving door is particularly abusive in agencies that have a huge flood of money going in. And so we need safeguards to make sure they are serving the public interest. You need a period of time where the close relationships and the networks kind of break down." Yeah, you do. Actually, what you need is proper regulation, and you need normal people, I would say, involved in these institutions. Not like, see this public watchdog that's actually exposed it, shows you how things should be run. Think about during the pandemic period, all those people that came forward at great risk to their personal career. Peter McCulloch, Robert Malone, Jay Bhattacharya, Dave Martin, Judy Miscavige, all those people that were willing to come forward and go, hang on a minute, this don't sound right. You, sir, and you, madam, are conspiracy theorists. That's what's going on here. I am the science, said Fauci. They were all right. They were correct. And the legacy media never investigated it because that's not what the legacy media does. As soon as the legacy media tells you they're in an investigation, you know something's going wrong. The pharmaceutical industry finances about 75% of the FDA's drug division. So the relevant bit, they almost entirely fund. Ban that overnight. We're going to have an FDA that's funded entirely separately from the pharmaceutical industry. Well, what makes you think that's such a good idea? I don't know. We're just noticing there's this massive opioid crisis. In a sense, it shows you, with barely any scrutiny at all, that the entire system is so corrupted that it could basically never work again because we've all somehow imbibed the wrong set of values. Now, have a radical reassessment of how the whole thing actually went down. During this COVID inquiry that's going on in our country right now, do you think they're going to say, hey, we made all these deals with Moderna, maybe we should shut down those factories now, maybe we should look at the relation? No, it'll be a very limited analysis. The bare minimum is what they'll do. And it was this person's fault and this person's fault, but the system itself is basically okay. They won't come up with a conclusion that many of you have already reached. The whole system is broken. You cannot trust the government. You cannot trust the media. It is time to oppose this power. Van Tam is prohibited from using privileged information from his time in government to further his business interests. Van Tam here. Van Tam, you're not using information gleaned from your time working in the government to advance your interests at Moderna. I'll be honest with you. That's all I'm doing. Rose Whiffen, the senior research officer at Transparency International UK, said, when companies employ former officials, regardless of whether they worked in that industry before their government role or not, it raises the risk of privileged information being misused for commercial benefit. Also, it creates a culture, which is basically the culture that you live in. Currently, there are only minimal safeguards against abuse of the revolving door between the public and private sector. The government should prohibit ex-senior civil servants and ministers from taking up positions where they've had substantial responsibility for policy relevant to hiring the company. Did you see this? Minimal safeguards against abuse of the revolving door. No records at the FDA of former employees. Well, you try going on X and putting up like a natural immunity and vitamin D are quite good. We're worried the vaccines might affect breast. Safeguards, regulations, records. There's records for you. You try being a dissenting voice. Suddenly, oh, hold on a minute, the mainstream media are interested. Let's do an investigation. Quick, put your best man on. Find everyone they've ever spoken to. That's interesting use of of resources, regulations for you, scrutiny for you, skepticism for you, transparency, no privacy for you, maximum privacy for them, no safeguards from them. Wow, guess who pays for it? They pay for it, so I get, no, we pay for it. We're funding it, they're exploiting it. When do you want to end it?
Sir Francis Bacon, who was a mid-16th to early 17th century guy. He was an English philosopher and statesman who served as Attorney General and Lord Chancellor of England under King James I. Bacon led the advancement of both natural philosophy and the scientific method. I think he's often called the father of empiricism, but he also played a leading role in establishing the British colonies in North America. And I think this may be the tie-in for Jefferson, especially in Virginia, the Carolinas, and Newfoundland. His government report on the Virginia colony was submitted in 1609, and there are some scholars, I can't verify one way or the other, but there are some scholars who believe he was largely responsible for the drafting in 1609 and 1612 of two charters of government for the Virginia colony. William Hepworth Dixon, this is over in Wikipedia, considered that Bacon's name could be included in the list of the founders of the United States, maybe a grandfather or a great-grandfather. Now, Benjamin Franklin was a big fan as well, and here he is in his Poor Richard's Almanac. Poor Richard improved in 1749. Put it this way, on the 7th of this month, 1626, died that great little man, Sir Francis Bacon, great in his prodigious genius, parts, and learning, and little in his servile compliances with a little court and submissive flattery of a little prince. I mean, not total fan. Pope characterizes him thus in one strong line. If parts allure thee, think how Bacon shined, the wisest, brightest, meanest of mankind. And one way that we can see some of Bacon's influence throughout Jefferson's writing, especially in later years, was the phrase, knowledge is power. And that's often attributed, as Monticello puts it here, to Francis Bacon from his Meditations Sacrae, 1597. And they point out that Jefferson used this phrase in his correspondence on at least 4 occasions, each time in connection with the establishment of a university in Virginia, which is what he thought was one of his most important projects. So here's a couple of examples. I've got 2 of them. One in a letter to George Tinkner in 1817. He says, knowledge is power, knowledge is safety, and knowledge is happiness. Benjamin Rush, some years later, earlier than this letter here, also said, without knowledge, without learning, people are incapable of knowing your rights. And if you can't know your rights, you don't know how to defend them. Without knowledge, you have no power. And Jefferson basically equated knowledge with power, safety, and happiness. And here he is again to a letter to Joseph C. Cabell, Christmas Day. This is what Jefferson is writing about, December 25th, 1820. He said, there are but 3 states smaller than Massachusetts, that she is the 21st only in the scale of size, and but 1/10 of that of Virginia. Yet it is unquestionable that she has more influence in our confederacy than any other state in it. I like that he still refers to it as a confederacy. Whence this ascendancy? From her attention to education unquestionably. And he said there can be no stronger proof that knowledge is power and that ignorance is weakness. And we see this all over today. There's so much ignorance on the founding principles, on the Constitution, on what liberty is all about, and how to defend all of them. That's basically the work that we do. We try to teach these original foundational principles, and of course, how to defend the Constitution and liberty when government refuses to do so, which is constant 24/7, 365. And a vast majority of the people are nowhere close to having knowledge. And therefore, the people are weak and the government is extremely, extremely strong. Sir Isaac Newton, not someone you would think of as having an influence on the founding generation, on the structure of the Constitution even. But there really is an interesting point to be made here from an article by Rob Natelson, The Ideas That Form the Constitution, Sir Isaac Newton, a really great series that he did on this, on some of the people who influenced the founders. And Joe Wolverton does awesome work on this as well. And Rob writes this, Sir Isaac Newton wasn't a political thinker like Marcus Cicero or John Locke, who we'll get to in a moment. He was a scientist. Indeed, he exemplified the scientific revolution, an event that changed not only how people thought about the physical universe, but also how they thought about politics in government. In that way, Newton and his scientific colleagues greatly affected the U.S. Constitution. I would rather call it the Constitution for the United States. Again, Rob says, the scientific revolution, and particularly Newton's work, taught men that the universe wasn't willful or chaotic, but governed by rules of order. Once you knew the rules, the physical universe becomes predictable. So, for example, if you know that if you vest the power of both declaring and waging war in one individual, that person will become very prone to waging the war or declaring the war in order to wage it. And that's what many of the founders said as well. If you give too much power to too few people, you shouldn't be surprised that power expands because it is a maxim of human nature that when you give power to anyone, whether it's vested in many or in a few, as Abigail Adams put it, it is ever grasping. So these are the types of things that we learn. And if you think about that first law of motion from Sir Isaac Newton, I know we probably all heard about something like this in science class many years ago, and I don't have this exact, but it's basically an object at rest tends to stay at rest, and an object in motion tends to stay in motion unless it's acted on by some external force. And so if you think about it in that context, a government that is always expanding, unless there is a counterbalancing force, it will relentlessly expand. And that's what really we've seen play out, because there has been almost no counterbalancing force in modern times. And so this government that starts to grow bit by bit for one emergency or another, for one extreme situation, you get a Federal Reserve and an income tax or the Patriot Act, these things that are supposed to be limited to very small things. And then they expand over time and they get worse and worse and worse. And unless states and people act as a counterbalance to the government, Lysander Spooner said, resistance is really the only way to keep a government in check. And that's the same thing that one of the first associate justices on the Supreme Court said, James Iredell. The inherent right of the people to prevent usurpation's exercise is the only way to stop that. That's how James Iredell put it. So if you think of it in that context, the idea of the 10th Amendment, the idea of nullification is very Newtonian. It's about acting, an external object acting against that federal government. Anyway.
White House says Israel has killed, quote, many, many thousands of innocents, end quote. That's an incredible admission that I think it was spokesman John Kirby made. And then here's what he says. The comments were made by White House National Security Council spokesman John Kirby, who previously told reporters to expect that Israel would continue to kill innocent civilians. So they've killed many thousands of innocent civilians, and they're going to kill thousands more. So just get used to it is basically, just put that up for one more second, is basically what Kirby is saying. And now this is Gaza's health ministry, so it's a government source. All government sources should be suspect on all sides. But Gaza's health ministry said on Tuesday that at least 10,328 Palestinians have been killed, including 4,237 children. Thousands more are missing and presumed to be under the rubble, buried under rubble for days and weeks.
See, this seems to be way out of proportion to war going on, innocents die and children get in the crossfire. But this number is so high, it's almost like, well, we have to stop the multiplying of people who are going to come and hurt us. And it's sort of a strategy that sort of is sickening. But the Biden administration has cast doubt on the numbers that are put out there. And like you said, there's reason to doubt. Why should we have to believe them? And Pentagon spokesman General Ryder has also acknowledged that thousands of civilians have been killed. Yeah. You know, because matter of fact, the way the language is on both sides. You know, there's factions on both sides that they're pretty tough and strong. That you know, this is not just target practice. Yeah. I mean, we have to wipe them out, and as if that's going to solve the problem. But that's a terrible philosophy to have. But here we're standing there, we're trying to figure out what's going on, and we might be a very, very influence in the whole mess. Help to create it. Yeah. Our weapons, our money, and people, and yet right now we'll probably talk about why they just sort of thumb their nose at us, even though the United States is doing all this mischief and providing the weapons and all, but they won't take any orders. And I think that if you're going to do it, the orders should change. You know, like if you won't do what we tell you, you know, we might just cut off your aid. Well, why did we ever start it? You know, that's my beef.
Yeah. Well, here's just an example of the absolute hypocrisy of the U.S. government, of the Biden administration. I'm sure he's joined by most Republicans on this. This is from the same article. Despite the grim death toll, the U.S. still refuses to place any limits on Israel's use of American weapons. Yeah. When asked on Tuesday about civilian casualties, Pentagon spokeswoman said, "We don't put conditions on weapons we're sending or that Israel is using." So can you imagine? I mean, this makes you an accomplice to the crime. If killing innocent children is a crime, then we're accomplices. It would be like if you went on a killing spree and killed about 20 people and then said, "Here, have some more guns." You want some more guns?
It seems to be difficult to get the right information and have the good journals like Blumenthal and others. But the reporting, you know, and you mentioned that they reported about why was it reported differently for Russia than for Israel, or the Palestinians for that matter, whoever's committing the violence. So I think that you know, it's so, you know, we think we're defending one side or opposing the other side and saying, well, Russia didn't do anything here. But I see it as very easy to say that if you believe that we should not be involved, that's the basic problem. All of a sudden, you look at the whole world differently. You say, well, you know, neither side is pure. and neither side is trying to institute the Bill of Rights, this sort of thing. So that I think is the big problem. And then we get into the factions, the money, and the corruption in governments, and the lying ineptness of government, and you end up with these crazy wars. And there's so many things that come of whether it's domestic, social, religious, or any kind of rules the government makes. It usually sometimes deliberate, but sometimes just because it's unworkable. To me, I always go back to monetary policy. This pretense that a couple people can get together. Oh, well, we know today the interest rates ought to go up 0.12%. It's all they brainwash themselves as well as they fit into the category of people who brainwash for a precise purpose.
A broken Netanyahu is miscalculating over Gaza, former Israeli PM says. And this is, you remember old Ehud Barak, who was I think he was a tanker he was a military guy. Go to the next one really quick. No, I'm sorry, Ehud Olmert. I'm sorry. What did I think? Yeah, sorry. Anyway, so he said that Benjamin Netanyahu has been destroyed emotionally by this massive failure on national security and is now miscalculating by preparing to take overall control of Gaza. So Ehud Olmert saying that Netanyahu is really basically flipped out and he's making all the wrong moves. And there is a consensus in Israel that that's what's happening.
Yeah. But there are so many parts that we try to understand and bring together because, it's their policy and they invite some problems. But you were earlier on mentioned the fact, well, are we going to mention maybe the United States is involved in these discrepancies? And then what's the position been for years with Israel? And how do they get support? I mean, the money, I think money counts, and when you get people dependent, that's why I think we have such problems on our borders. I think if you subsidize something, you get more of it. And we get more problems by subsidizing, illegal immigration. The rewards you get if you can sneak into this country and we'll open up the gates. Sort of reminds me of opening up the gates. So you go on in, have fun in the Capitol, then we're going to arrest you.
Yeah, exactly. No kidding.
But there's a lot of things that are behind the scenes that happen. The money, the military-industrial complex, religious beliefs. It's just very complex. That's why it should be kept more simple. It should be. It doesn't have to be this way. You don't have to initiate the. If people would accept just one rule, one moral standard, and that is you have no right to interfere in other people's lives or in their property. But that just is beyond them. Everybody wants an angle, and then they are propagandized, and they have to be placed in fear. You have to scare them to death, and the end of the world's coming if you don't support the troops. And it's worked. It's worked for centuries. And I'd like to sort of say, try something new.
Yeah.
Government, by its very nature, possesses a monopoly on the use of force in a given area. In a free society, this monopoly must be strictly restrained and directed towards the defense of rights. The role of government should be limited to safeguarding our rights from any aggression or violation, upholding justice through due process, and holding accountable those who commit wrongs, including unjust infringements of rights. However, our current federal government has failed to address many legitimate grievances, including sacrificing lives in unjust wars of aggression sold through propaganda from both sides of the state media. The creation of a central bank that finances endless wars and government programs through inflation, devaluing the currency and eroding purchasing power. The capture of the political landscape by a disguised duopoly, the Republicans and Democrats, which perpetuates tyranny at the expense of freedom. The increasing influence of government in economic decisions, resulting in market failures and misallocation of resources, mismanagement and lack of funding for fraudulent Ponzi schemes such as Social Security. The division and manipulation of the population by pseudo-state-run media. The indoctrination of children with biased history, and the promotion of alternative sex lifestyles at an early age. The shift away from the near realization of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s vision, which called for the evaluation of individuals based on their character rather than the color of their skin, towards a growing emphasis on race, particularly driven by those who engage in virtue signaling and vociferously decry racism. Within the mainstream media, can be attributed to the surge of identity politics and critical race theory, which are taught at government schools and disseminated through the two sides of the state media. Excessive taxation at every level, including income, inflation, estate, and property taxes. The protection of government officials through qualified immunity, enabling abuse of positions and violation of rights. Unethical government experiments on innocent people without their consent. The COVID response, including lockdowns, closing of businesses, censorship, canceling of opposition, including the taking away of licenses of doctors and suppression of alternate perspectives. Collateral damage in unjust wars fought by the government. The actions of Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, which undermined the autonomy of a voluntary union of states and turned it into a gang of coerced states. Spying on American citizens without warrants, infringing on privacy rights. Therefore, we assert that it is time to reclaim our individual sovereignty and restore the true spirit of self-governance.
The Pentagon said on Wednesday night that the U.S. launched more airstrikes in eastern Syria that targeted a facility used by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and affiliated groups. So Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said in a statement, quote, "The strike was conducted by 2 U.S. F-15s against a weapons storage facility," end quote. He said the strike was a, quote, "response to a series of attacks against U.S. personnel in Iraq and Syria by IRGC affiliates," end quote. So when he says IRGC affiliates, he is referring to the Shia militias that operate in Iraq and Syria. So the U.S. launched a similar airstrike recently on October 27th, and they said the purpose of that was to deter further attacks on U.S. troops, but it's very clear that did not work. There's still been there was more attacks on U.S. bases reported on Wednesday. The count now is that since October 17th, there's been 41 attacks on U.S. troops based in Iraq and Syria, and at least 45 troops have been injured. So an umbrella group of Shia militias that calls itself the Islamic Resistance of Iraq has taken credit for many of the attacks on U.S. bases. The militias receive support from Iran, but it is unclear if Iran is directing these attacks or if they are involved. The Pentagon has previously acknowledged that it has no evidence of direct Iranian involvement. And for their part, Iran is strongly denying that they have any role in these attacks on U.S. troops. Responding to the U.S. allegations, Iran's representative to the UN said on Tuesday that they, quote, "have never been involved in any actions or attacks directed at the United States military forces in Syria and Iraq," end quote. So something to keep in mind that Iran is strongly denying they're involved here. Another thing to keep in mind is that, we can't really take the Pentagon at face value for what they say they bombed in eastern Syria. There's many examples of them either lying about what they hit or being wrong because they had bad intelligence. So it might become clear in the next couple of days. If there's casualties, we haven't seen any reports of casualties yet. And one thing that we should worry about here is that they say they're targeting an Iranian military site used by the IRGC. If any IRGC personnel are killed or wounded in this attack, then that risks a huge escalation with Iran. And Austin in his press statement about these airstrikes said that the U.S. urges against escalation, but it's clear to me that these Shia militias are not going to back down. They didn't back down the last time. Why would they back down now? They only ramped up attacks against U.S. forces. So things are just going to escalate here, I assume. And as long as the U.S. is backing Israel's, brutal assault on Gaza, I just don't see this de-escalating. The responsible thing for the U.S. to do would be to leave Iraq and Syria, but realistically, we know that's not going to happen, unfortunately. Yemen's Houthis said on Wednesday that their military successfully downed a U.S. MQ-9 Reaper drone that was flying off the coast of Yemen. A U.S. official later confirmed that the Houthis downed an American drone and said the U.S. was analyzing the incident. So the Houthis, they're formerly known as Ansar Allah. They have been firing missiles and drones toward Israel and say the attacks will keep up until the Israeli onslaught of Gaza comes to an end. In a statement, the Houthis said the U.S. drone that was downed was deployed to back Israel. So they're saying the MQ-9 Reaper drone that they shot down was deployed as part of the U.S. effort to protect Israel. And an MQ-9 Reaper drone can be used for surveillance, but they are also used for drone strikes. They can carry very powerful missiles. The U.S. uses them quite a bit in their drone strikes. So the Houthi statement said, quote, "Our air defenses were able to down an American MQ-9 while it was carrying out hostile surveillance and espionage activities in Yemeni territorial waters as part of American military support for Israel," end quote. So the downing of this drone, of course, raises questions about a potential American response. In October, the Pentagon said that a U.S. warship in the Red Sea had intercepted drones and missiles that the Houthis fired toward Israel, and we know there's a lot of American firepower in the region now, even more so than usual. The Houthis have downed American drones before, I believe in 2019. I know that same year Iran downed a drone. And so we'll see. And we always have to keep in mind that the U.S. has basically been at war with the Houthis for many years now. The U.S. has backed the Saudi-led coalition against them since 2015. Thankfully, there's been a ceasefire since April 2022 that's held pretty well. But the war's not over. They haven't signed a peace deal or anything. And the U.S. also has a military presence in Yemen. There's U.S. troops in Yemen. We don't know how many, but they are there. Biden confirmed that to Congress not too long ago. And they're in Yemen on the ground to fight Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, AQAP. That's at least on paper what the U.S. troops are in Yemen for. And something always worth pointing out is that the Houthis were actually briefly an American partner in the fight against AQAP. The U.S. was sharing intelligence with them in 2015, right before backing the Saudi-led coalition against them. And then that coalition, the Saudi-UAE coalition, was basically, on Al-Qaeda's side against the Houthis, and they actually recruited Al-Qaeda fighters to fight on the ground for them. And U.S. weapons sold to the Saudis and the UAE ended up in Al-Qaeda's hands in Yemen. So it's just a mess. Ukraine's CIA-backed military intelligence has taken credit for a car bombing that killed a politician in Russian-controlled eastern Ukraine on Wednesday. So this guy's name is Mikhail Filiponenko, probably pronouncing that wrong, and he's a member of the local Russian-backed legislature in Luhansk, and he's a former police chief. He was killed in his car outside of his house. He was born in Luhansk. He was Ukrainian-born, and he joined the separatists who declared the creation of the Luhansk People's Republic in 2014, following the coup that ousted former President Viktor Yanukovych in Kiev. So according to AP, he had actually survived a previous car bombing on February 21st, 2022. So they've been after this guy for a while, and that was 3 days before Russia actually invaded Ukraine. It's an example of how there was a war going on in eastern Ukraine before the Russian invasion.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
And one night, we were having dinner with you and myself, Scott Ritter, and we were talking about Kennedy's stance on Israel. And what did you do?
I texted him and told him we were talking about it, didn't expect anything. And I got a long defensive reply. You and Gerald have to leave me alone. Everybody around me is telling me I'm wrong on Israel. I know I'm right on Israel. My family has a history with Israel, blah, 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 blah. But Bobby, I love you, but this is a deal breaker. And then I know what happened to you. Before this event, you donated to his campaign, and then trying to get your money back was like pulling teeth, but eventually they did, because the last thing in the world they want is you with your megaphone saying, Bobby won't give me my money back. It's not the same Bobby to whom I gave my money. And it wasn't. He did a 180 degree on the most fundamental, 180 degree change on the most fundamental issue of our day, war and peace.
War and peace.
Well, I love him as a person.
And I donated the maximum that you're allowed to donate.
Right.
So that's how much I believed in him. There's nobody there. We are on, again, as you well know, in the Trends Journal, before 2 days before Russia invaded Ukraine. The cover of the Trends Journal, from COVID war to Ukraine war to World War. People forgot about the Ukraine war. That's over now. World War III has begun. World War III has begun. It has now escalated into the Middle East. The people have absolutely no idea of the facts. In talking about Israel, I talk to people. Do you know about the Judicial Reform Act? You know about the 39 weeks of protests where hundreds of thousands of people were taking to the streets week after week after week after week in Israel? And I said, when all else fails, they take you to war. And now the information's out there that Netanyahu knew, the government knew that this attack was going to happen. It's all in your Trends Journal, not our facts, the facts that are being reported.
Is that being reported in the Israeli press?
That's reported some of it, yes, this is from the intelligence sources, and the United States had warned them, Egypt had warned them, and Netanyahu threw one of the generals out and said, "Well, I don't want to get out of here." They wanted this to happen because the people couldn't stand Netanyahu. The same thing happened with little Georgie Bush. People forget the dot-com bust, America in a deep recession. They couldn't stand Bush, and then 9/11 happens.
Well, same thing with FDR and Pearl Harbor. But this Netanyahu thing is very serious. He'll end up in jail when this war is over, so he has an incentive not to end the war.
That's
right. He told ABC News just yesterday that he expected that Israel will be responsible for security in Gaza, meaning
Isn't that nice?
they will post prison guards in the concentration camp.
Yeah.
Because the longer he can extend this the longer he stays in office. But once it's over and they have their investigation, and one thing about the Israeli government, they investigate everything. They have their investigation. All fingers will point at him. He will lose not only his job, but his liberty.
Yeah. But this guy is a maniac. He's the longest serving prime minister in Israel, in and out, up and down, keeps coming back. He will do anything to remain in power.
I'm sorry to say I agree with you. I say sorry because that anything includes the destruction of innocent human life, which happens as we speak, including the lives of Israelis.
Yeah.
You know, when this is the tyranny of the majority, people accept as legitimate what majoritarian governments declare, and the tyranny of the majority is often worse than the tyranny of a madman. Everybody knows the madman is mad, but most people give credence to the majority.
Yeah. And we have the madmen in charge in a country near you. Look at the little freaks. And by the way, your article that's coming out tomorrow, this is what everybody should read. And you find more, by the way, you go to the judge's channel and you got to see the people that he's putting on there day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. Judging freedom. Go to this channel, and the article that you have coming out tomorrow, unconstitutional killings. Yep, unconstitutional killings. And you were talking about madmen, and they are the leaders of our country, and you name them.
I'm talking about George W. Bush and Barack Obama and Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Trump the least, Bush the worst, but now Biden dragging out. I point out the people he killed with drones and crowed about it, but now dragging us into two wars, neither of which has been declared by Congress. They have a real albatross on their hands with Ukraine, Gerald. The world now accepts and understands that Ukraine lost. American and EU diplomats are speaking below the radar about negotiation. They're not going to get nearly as good a deal as Russia and Ukraine agreed to 2 years ago before the United States and Great Britain got involved and said, we'll give you everything you want. Remember Kissinger? I disagreed with him in many things, but this line is true. It's bad to be America's enemy. It's worse to be America's friend. America relies on you, promises you it has your back, and just like Vietnam, just like Iraq, sells you down the river. I don't know how the neocons and the people around Biden are going to get out of this other than by diverting our attention to another war, the one in Gaza.
Yeah. And again, what's very important, you said to divert our attention. As I keep saying, when all else fails, they take you to war.
Yes.
And
yes.
We are in World War III.
Gerald, the world was shocked by Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but Americans who had just been spoon-fed bitter hatred for all things Japanese for 4 years were not shocked. The world was not shocked when Barack Obama evaporated an American, never charged with a crime, sitting in a cafe in Yemen. The world was not shocked when George Bush caused 1 million deaths and borrowed and spent $3 trillion in the fruitless, useless invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Nobody was shocked when Trump boasted about using a drone to kill a Iranian general peaceably on his way to lunch in Iraq with some friends of his. And now, why isn't anybody saying, well, why are we fighting Russia? Why are we using a corrupt, Nazi-run vassal state to fight Russia? Why are we giving them $100 billion? There was no reason for that. That argument falls on deaf ears because the pro-war party wants more war.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
In the 18, go back to the 1820s and 30s, you have this movement that begins in England called the Plymouth Brethren, founded by a fellow named John Nelson Darby. And this is a new set of interpretations based on a very literalistic reading of the Old Testament. So he was frustrated with he was an Anglican cleric who was frustrated with the not seriousness or theological liberalism of the Church of England. And so he was looking for groups of people who would read the Bible with him very closely, and they were reading in a very literalistic fashion. And so they came to believe that the promises for ethnic Israel in the Old Testament are still applicable for ethnic Jews and not transformed in this way in the New Testament. And so God's plan for humanity is temporarily suspended. As we said, the word parenthesis is used while he works with the church, which is all ethnic groups, but then will be continued when the Jews return to Israel, rebuild the temple, and then convert eventually to believing in Jesus on a large scale. And there's various, so I'm a Hebrew Bible scholar. I've studied the history of religion. This is not my particular field, but I lived in it, as a person, as an adherent to it for a while. But I think that part of the reason why this spreads, there's a few stages that lead to this spread. One is that there's a desire among the lay people to have these Bible reading groups that get back to the biblical text, apart from establishment religious figures like theologians and church hierarchies. This gets exported then to America, or imported to America, where there's a much more free market in religion, and it's very difficult to have religious authority in the frontier. So if you're a Presbyterian or a Catholic, a Presbyterian minister or a Catholic bishop, you can do what you can do, and you're, maybe supervising a few different churches. You're riding on a circuit in the 1860s to minister at all these churches. But then if some guy shows up in your town, one of these towns throws up a tent and starts preaching revivals,
right.
he can just do whatever he wants.
Evangelical, the U.S. was an open market for evangelicals. So here's my question now. Let's say you're an evangelical and you believe
one more really important step that happens here. It does actually go through traditional authorities. In 1909, there's a lawyer, not a theologian, named Cyrus Scofield, guy with a rather sketchy pre-Christian personal life and no theological training, but he writes notes on the Bible, like study notes on the Bible that contain this perspective. And he had a friend who was at Oxford University Press. And so in 1909, his notes were actually published by OUP as the official King James Bible that was published in the United States. And so this is how this particular approach spread very widely to American households. How does that happen? So
just some random guy's notes gets canonized as if it's like Christian lore?
I don't know. He was very entrepreneurial. And I would say, having read these, so a funny story is that the Christian university that I attended, which no longer holds this perspective, was actually a predecessor or a successor university or institution to a Bible institute founded by this guy, C.I. Scofield. So we had to read these notes when I was in college. We had to read the Bible along with these notes, even though most of the professors didn't take them that seriously anymore. But most of this stuff is pretty common sense, I would say. It's really only a very handful of passages that have this particular perspective. So there's not really a lot of red flags if you're just a traditional Christian reader. This gets in very easily. But now it is that sort of like popular level plus the authority, the authenticity that gets given by the OUP publication.
So let's go. You're a hardcore evangelical. Let's just say that there was a committee of hardcore evangelicals, and let's just imagine a universe where literally there was a one world government, and these 5 people sat on top of the one world government, and they controlled the world, and they could absolutely make decisions. So I'm asking, would step 1 to them be, hey, we got to round up all the Jews and send them to Israel? Step 2 is we got to figure out how to convert them to Judaism. Step 3, we need them to go build a temple. Like what like I'm just saying, if they could absolutely to a T work out their plan and get us, anyone who accept Jesus into their heart, their ticket to heaven, because they believe that this is like in their heads, this is what God wants. God wants us to be in heaven, and he gave us a specific recipe on how to do it. And now you've got full control to go exercise and do it. Is that the recipe here? Step 1, force everyone to go there. Step 2, force them to convert. Step 3, we got to force them to build a temple. And then it goes on autopilot from there. Like we've done the steps we need to do.
Yeah, the way you put it sounds very. Because you've created this one world government that makes this happen, it sounds very coercive. But what I think,
yes, you're saving everyone from eternal damnation, and you're bringing about God's plan into the world. So who cares? Once we're working with God's will, you can remove our earthly concerns about force, because you've got the word of God in your hands, and of course you should use force. You can save people.
Well, I don't think most people, even who believe in Scripture, would put it in that way, because the use of force would override the choices that people made. And you can't force someone to believe in
who in this
something.
prophecy said anything about needing to make choices?
And that's the problem, is that I think what most people don't understand is that what we have, and many Jewish scholars and Christian scholars have pointed this out, is that it's like the relation between religious or Jews and Christian Zionists is kind of a marriage of convenience, because Christian Zionists all believe that Jews need to believe in Jesus in order to have a relationship with God and be saved. So it does feel like this, like,
just in terms of understanding, if you're a hardcore evangelical and you had the power to do what I said, is that the recipe?
That sounds, yes, I guess that's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
Because I have a funny feeling this might come up in the debate. People heard you give a very fiery speech at the Republican Jewish Coalition event, but then at the same time, you've been getting in trouble because you've been tweeting and talking about concern about a wider war, World War III, war with Iran, the possibility of a wider conflict. So can you just clarify what your overall stance is?
So I have very clear views on this. I'm running for U.S. president, not running for the president of any other country, not the president of Israel, not any other. And I said the exact line that said the Republican Jewish coalition when I said, I'm not running for president of Israel, I'm running for president of the U.S. I happen to believe that Israel deserves to have one state, a state that exists. The state of Israel, one state for the Jewish people, when they have countless other states across the Islamic world for the descendants of Ishmael. Well, I think that the descendants of Abraham, by way of Isaac, has historically viewed the Jewish homeland as their state. I think that's appropriate. But my job as U.S. president is to stand for American interests. So I do not want the U.S. getting involved in another war in the Middle East. I don't think that advances our interests. I could make a strong case, and I did, that also doesn't advance Israel's own interests. Israel's founding premise was that it was supposed to stand for its own national self-existence. Their George Washington figure was David Ben-Gurion, who said the nation of Israel was formed to reject the premise that Jews should depend on the fleeting sympathies of others in the West. That didn't work out. And David Ben-Gurion said, no, we're going to defend ourselves in our own homeland. And I support Israel's right to defend itself. I really do. Diplomatically, as a partner of Israel, that's what I support. Diplomatically, Israel's right to exist and its right to defend itself. That's a different question from U.S. involvement. And so my view is the U.S. should not get involved in another conflict in the Middle East that doesn't advance the U.S. interest. To the contrary, we're now learning that we have troops in places like Syria and Iraq where we were told, or at least it was suggested that we had left. Now we realize they're sitting targets. We shouldn't be there. That's my punchline focus. I think it is absolutely clear view. It doesn't fall in one of the other neat orthodoxies of the Republican Party or otherwise, or opponents to the Republican Party. It's a pro-American view that says my moral obligation as your next president is to the citizens of this country. That's my exclusive moral obligation, not to anybody else. That's why I favor ending the Ukraine war, stop funding Ukraine, deliver terms of peace, a reasonable peace treaty, a reasonable peace agreement that would allow Ukraine to have its sovereignty intact, but otherwise ended this war. And it's also what I say here in the United States is that our message to Iran should be, you stay the hell out of this, we stay the hell out of it, and let Israel get the job that it needs to get done without us interfering in either direction, either in the direction of getting militarily involved to fight some war, or in the direction of getting involved to constrain Israel from defending its own homeland. The U.S. needs to stay out. That's my view.
Again, Nikki Haley, who does not like you, by the way, wasn't satisfied with your answer because it looked as if you were saying nobody should be getting foreign aid from the U.S. And then it became, well, with Israel, when they say they don't need it, then we'll stop giving it to them, which means never. So the concern that
I don't think it means never is the thing I would say there. I can make that. I'll make that case to you. But here's my view: stand by prior commitments. If we made prior commitments, stand by them. And implicit in that aid was a standing $3 to $3.8 billion commitment to Israel. Now, I could make a case, and I think that many in Israel would find it persuasive, that it's not even helpful to Israel, right? Because then the U.S. is meddling in their affairs, telling them what they can and cannot do. So I don't think it's good for either party, and I think there should come a time where it is both in the U.S. interest and in the Israeli interest to say that we don't want this level of meddling. My rule of thumb, Tom, for any new aid, and I'm against the $14 to $16 billion aid package for Israel that's making its way that the House just voted on, I'm against that. And the reason why is I don't think that we should be giving foreign aid to any country whose national debt per capita is less than ours. Just think about that. We have more national debt per capita in this country. Why are we giving our money away willy-nilly? It's like the arguments I used to make for corporations. Your obligation is to your shareholders. Don't just give your money away effectively to subsidize some environmental or social agenda. Well, if my job's as U.S. president, I can't use our taxpayer money to give foreign aid willy-nilly. If somebody else needs something, if they need supplies, sell it to them. We do that. We have those agreements. But this idea of foreign aid, we need to bring it back to zero-based budgeting to foreign aid. Ask what's actually necessary to advance the American interest. That's how we should use our own dollars. So my view is I'm against any new aid funding this war. Stand by prior commitments that we've already made, because I do believe that, even if there were, I would say, decisions made in the past, whether or not I agree with them, I stand by the decisions we have made in the past. And I'll respect that. That's part of what it means to, just be a trustworthy actor. But short of that, any new foreign aid, any elective foreign aid, I would end it to any country whose national debt per capita is less than ours. And any foreign aid, period, whether it's to a country regardless of their national debt, would be exclusively grounded in what advances the American interest.
Within the Republican Party, would you say it's foreign policy specifically where there's the biggest divide among candidates and voters? Yeah. Or where do you think this big divide is?
I think it's on a couple of different axes. I mean, the most important one when it comes to policy, there are some other divisions that don't really relate to policy, which I can talk about, that relate more to character of leadership and I think a generational change that's required, frankly, in both parties. But as it relates to policy, yeah, it's foreign policy. I mean, everybody agrees that it's not good for men to be stealing trophies from women in the swim lanes. Okay, that's fine. We all agree on that, and different people will show different levels of outrage about it. The real divide is when it comes to foreign policy, do you believe in exclusively advancing the American interest, or do you believe it's America's job to be a global hegemon that plays effectively the role of the global police? That's a divide, and you can make legitimate arguments on either side. I'm on one side of that divide. Most of the other candidates in this race are on the other side of that divide. It's Dick Cheney 2.0, as I said, and voters deserve that choice. If that's what voters want, I met people across this country. I don't think that is what they want, but it's fine for a candidate to stand for that point of view. Now, many of them are standing for that point of view because some of them stand to make money off of it. That's the dirty little secret of this. You take a Nikki Haley. I mean, this is disgusting, right? Somebody who went from being in debt in her time when she left the UN to becoming a military contractor, sitting on the board of Boeing, collecting stock options during this presidential campaign, making $8 million plus. War is hell unless you're actually a military contractor sitting on the board of Boeing, in which case war is good. So that incentivizes some of these people to adopt policies that really are about lining their own pocketbook, not about their actual views. But other people, I think, genuinely hold this view that it's the job of the United States to be the global police, even if that does lead to armed conflict from time to time. That's the real divide. Are you a George Washington vision? Do you have a George Washington vision for the future of our foreign policy in this country? I do. I ask, would this make George Washington proud or not? I think he would be appalled at what he sees today. That's the real divide.
Welcome to Liberty Lockdown. Please scan your barcode. Your liberty ain't gone, but yeah, it's on hold.
The most recent video I thought was really interesting, and I've been dealing with this a lot lately, where I'm trying to decide how I should approach, my fellow man when it comes to the programming that they're receiving. Primarily, after it became legal for the federal government to propagandize the American people, it has gotten significantly worse. And while my frustration has grown exponentially, it has also kind of given me more pause and given me more reason to have sympathy for them, because they are being propagandized so heavily. So it's like, can I judge these people, as viciously as I would like to, because they're so out of their fucking minds. But at the same time, it's like, oh no, I get it.
Yeah, that pretty well describes my focus for the last 5 or 10 years. Like, I've been focused on the philosophy stuff for 27 now, but the whole thing of human psychology and getting through to people when you're telling them something that doesn't match their worldview, I'd like it if you could just here's the evidence, here's the logic, ta-da. That doesn't work. And so I made a course called Candles in the Dark, which is about how to talk to people to bring out from them the part of them that already understands freedom and all that. But one of the first challenges, which you expressed quite well, is not letting ourselves view them as the enemy, as these obnoxious, sort of like the Matrix thing, because they're trying to do what they think is right. Now they're being gullible, they're being stupid, they're falling for just ridiculous authoritarian garbage. But most people are still trying to do the right thing. And so it can be, it's very tempting to just tell them, you're stupid. I can't believe you fell for this and you fell for that. And you're cheering for evil. That doesn't win people over. But if you can try to get to the part of them that cares and is trying to do the right thing and acknowledge that part, and then sort of gently lead them to start looking more carefully at basically how they were tricked into their goodness being used as a, cheerleader for evil, basically. But it's definitely a challenge.
Yeah, well, it is a challenge. And I think my frustration is just that it's not that it seems as if these lessons can't be learned. It's not being extrapolated upon. A lot of people have woken up to the insanity of, say, the War on Terror or the Patriot Act, and they realize oh, that was really dumb. But they'll still apply the exact same reciprocity principle to what Hamas did to Israel and say, well, Israel can do whatever it wants. Look at what we did after 9/11. It's well, what we did after 9/11 was a fucking disaster.
Right, that was wrong too.
Yeah. So why can't you extrapolate?
Yeah, and most people, a thing we focus on in Candles in the Dark is when you talk to people, make sure you're asking them questions that are literal, personal, and specific, because what they want is vague, policy mush, Israel should be allowed to defend itself. Okay, Israel's a place. It doesn't defend itself. It has a ruling class. Which part of that is defending itself? But if you break it down to, okay, Mr. Person I'm talking to who fell for this garbage. I mean, you don't say that part out loud.
Definitely don't say that part.
If you could press a button and blow up 5 members of Hamas and 10 innocent little children, would you do that? And to start them thinking in the direction of, okay, you can't just go, oh, whatever you have to do. Would you actually do that? And some people may say yes, and they may get defensive and weird. And some people, well, no, but I mean, what are we supposed to do about it? But just to start them in the direction of trying to get them to look at what they're actually advocating. And this is true whether it's warmongering or authoritarian statism in anything. If you walk the average liberal through this process when it comes to gun control and say, okay, if I possess something that's the politicians have declared illegal, what do you want to have done to me? And be specific. Not, well, you'll get arrested. I didn't ask what would happen. I asked, what do you want to have happen? When they have to state the specific violence themselves, suddenly they hem and haw and they start to question things, almost always. Now, every once in a while, you get somebody who will double down. Well, I should kick down your door and shoot you. Okay, so you demonstrate how anti-gun violence you are by wanting me shot in my living room. Okay, thanks for the honesty.
And to see that, once again, really all it takes is a crisis. I think that's what I keep coming back to is if people are scared, if they're panicked, they're just going to go along with whatever their alleged leaders tell them to do. But these politicians that are the alleged leaders are fucking scum of the earth, evil psychopaths, and they still turn to them in these times of crisis. Is there anything that, like, messaging wise, that you go to someone that, like, they're on the cusp of being awake but not fully there, but then a crisis strikes and then they just turn back to Joe Biden and say, do whatever you have to do? How do you reach those people, or is it just a matter of time?
Well, again, I think the lack of clarity of thought in most people, like mushy-headedness plus fear equals cheerleaders for evil.
Yeah.
And so it can be really difficult to undo the fear, because if they think, the world's about to come to an end if we don't have this authoritarian solution, to try to talk them out of that threat almost never works. Because if they're, and that's, I mean, the tyrants are pretty smart about this. They're utterly evil, but they're smart because they know that fear shuts down the rational brain.
Mm-hmm.
And so trying to gently logic somebody through something when they're like flipping out, like, yeah, but the world's going to end. So the other side of it is, okay, let's accept that the world is going to end or really horrible things are happening. What exactly should be done about it? And if you're passing off the decision on what should be done to someone else, well, let the government and let the military do whatever they need to do. You need to basically question them in a way that brings it back to them. And this is why, both sides, they always show, here's a dead child that you killed. But both authoritarian sides always do that because it makes people angry and emotional. And so just saying, okay, that's really horrible. Are you aware of the fact that the people who did that, like pretending they actually did it, they did that really horrible thing because they were really mad at an injustice. So my question is, are you them? Are you the person who is willing to do things which is going to do something that horrible because you're so mad about an injustice? Because if so, you are the mirror image of what you're condemning. Now, if you can say, no, I want it directed, I want just the aggressors, just the people who did this horrible thing, I just want them harmed, but no innocence. Okay, now you're being moral and principled and actually thinking, and now I'm on your side. And that's true in both directions of like almost every conflict, because there's nasty people on both sides, and both of them are using the nastiness of the other to justify their own nastiness.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously it's a challenge to get people to think that clearly, because they're just like, I'm really mad at the other side. Well, they're really mad at you. And meanwhile, the tyrants are sitting back laughing at both sets of pawns for being stupid enough to fall for this.
Right.
While they're safe and, they're probably having tea somewhere together while you guys are murdering each other.
But listening to debates, I listened diligently, and I came away with saying not a whole lot is going to change. I wasn't saying, well, there were 5 of them in there, and I would say, well, this one was, if we had to take one, this is the one I would take. That would be hard for me. There's maybe 1 or 2 I might put at the bottom of the list. That's easier to do than to put somebody at the top of the list. But that's why the situation with a bankrupt country, financially and morally, there's not much to offer, because they all endorse a basic principle that I, in a way, detest. And the principle that pervades all philosophic positions who want significant government, that's interventionism.
Yeah.
The government's role, the people to give this authority to the government, the government's role is to do these things, make us safe and secure. And I would say that I think most Americans sort of like the idea of the empire. They might want to tinker with it a little bit, but they like that. They feel proud about that. And there's lots of things I feel proud about America, and I'm glad I'm here.
Yeah.
But it's not because we attempt to run the world, because that's where I see most of our problem. So I was looking for answers. I didn't get any real answers, but I'm just wondering what you've been thinking about from the results of this little debate.
I mean, it is a charade, isn't it? I mean, this is. I mean, it's almost like we're a non-serious country. We're pretending that these people were significant that were up there. None of them have a chance whatsoever of beating Trump at all, and it's sort of a whole pretend thing. And they all come out and they look the same. They say the same things. And meanwhile, you have Trump holding this massive rally, lots of cheering. It's a full audience here, and there's just no energy in the room with the GOP. And that's your earlier point, by the way. I do owe Elon Musk a thank you, because without his Twitter/X, I wouldn't have been able to do anything, because I did not watch it, but I did watch some good clips. But it's a complete charade. It's so superficial, everything they said. I mean, here's an example. Frank Luntz, who didn't like you very much, if you remember back when you were running. He put out a tweet saying something like, wow, Nikki Haley sure is showing her foreign policy expertise. And it's a clip of her just saying, bomb everyone, bomb everyone. Bomb. I mean, that's what passes for expertise. It's just incredible. I mean, and I don't know who did this. I was looking in the morning, and I should have put it on a bookmark, but someone pointed out that really this is the return of the GOP to its 2002 roots, where everyone was a neocon, everyone was for the Iraq War, everyone was for all of this stuff. I mean, we haven't learned anything from it, I think. But I did pull a couple of clips that I thought were somewhat indicative. of what we saw. And let's go ahead and grab for that first clip. This is sort of a montage of 2 or 3 of the candidates talking about their foreign policy and what they would do. It's a short clip, but it's worth listening. This is basically the whole thing in a nutshell.
As President of the United States, what would you be urging Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to do at this moment? Governor DeSantis. I would be telling Bibi, finish the job once and for all with these butchers. Hamas.
The first thing I said to him when it happened was I said, finish them, finish them.
I would tell him to smoke those terrorists on his southern border. And I'll tell the President of the United States, I'll be smoking the terrorists on our southern border. If you want to stop the 40+ attacks on military personnel in the Middle East, you have to strike in Iran. As President of the
Okay, so you got to finish them. You got to kill everyone in Gaza. Then you got to kill all the people on our border. And then you got to kill Iran. That's basically the GOP foreign policy in a nutshell.
If I had that chance, which wouldn't occur, I would advise them that get prepared, find out who your friends are, and maybe they're your neighbors that can do this, and seek them, because we are shrinking our empire and our enthusiasm for world domination, so things would change. And I think of the time he came, Netanyahu came, and he was given the privilege. He was practically an American. He got to speak in the Senate, on the House floor. You know, when these guys come, their qualifications aren't all that hot. You know, and they get more time on the floor than I can get.
That's right, exactly.
I never was able to go down there.
Gentleman's time is expired.
But I remember one thing that he said at the speech, and that was, "We don't need American troops. We will fight our own battle, but." You know, they have these other things, and I would remind him of that. And I applauded you when you said you don't need American troops, and I would say he still isn't saying send troops, but you're sending money, send money. You know, make sure that we're really bankrupt. Make sure our kids get, suffer from inflation and all these things. So it is still meddling. It comes across, but so you can't really sterilize yourself from the pain and suffering that is caused when you depend on somebody else. But I often thought that that whole area over there, if there was less foreign powers being involved, the better. And yet it's been not only groups of countries, but it's been globalism. You know, the things that they worked on ever since World War I, you know, divide up Europe, and then after World War II, they did the same thing, and they're still doing it. And we're the ringleaders. We're in there, and it doesn't solve the problem. It spends a lot of money. Oh, we'll do it for humanitarian reasons. We're not going to shoot anybody. Oh, but we'll use a drone to do the shooting. You know, that sort of thing. So I guess Netanyahu is facing some challenges too, and we'll have to see what happens, because things aren't going well for anybody. And I think this is part of the whole thing. The big picture is we're bankrupt. That makes the world suffer from bankruptcy, and that is the challenge to a reserve currency, and also the disintegration of the American empire. And everybody who depends on us now are getting a little bit nervous, and they're thinking, well, where are we going to find another empire to identify with? And it won't be solved easily.
Was where now Ramaswamy, people say he was a star of the show. We have mixed feelings about him. There's some things we like about him. There are some other things we don't. I was talking to our studio people earlier, and I said he's kind of the inverse Ron Paul. He says everything to every audience that he thinks they want to hear, rather than like you have always done, which is have one message and tell it to everyone. But nevertheless, he was very strong. He came out very strong at the debate.
Well, you know why I do it my way? It's easier.
That's right.
I don't have to have
100 speeches.
What group is this now? What group is this now? You know, that makes it very difficult, and you have to be pretty shrewd to become successful. Otherwise, you'll make enemies. But if you can unify people with a positive message, that sort of excites me.
I remember people asking, well, who's Ron Paul's speechwriter? He said, what are you talking about? He's his own speechwriter. He doesn't need a team of people. Okay, we're going to go meet with the 4-H club. You know?
There was something that came up when I was shifted in my congressional district from a rural district to an urban district where there was more, commercialism. And they say, and the press report says, now that they've switched you, how are you going to adapt your position from taking care of your rural farm issues, and now you're going to have this urban issue? And it was an insulting question today.
Really,
I said, well, I thought all people liked liberty.
Exactly.
We call for the extreme reduction in the size and scope of the bloated and overreaching federal government, and advocate for the recognition and preservation of independent states and localities. We affirm that the government closest to home is most easy to hold accountable. We believe that local communities should have the power to determine their own laws and governance in accordance with the will and consent of their citizens. In embracing our individual independence, we commit ourselves to the principles of personal responsibility, self-reliance, and respect for the rights of others. We stand united in securing our own individual liberties and resisting any encroachments upon them. True freedom requires active participation, vigilance, and a steadfast commitment to the principles outlined in this declaration. We declare our intent to foster a society that upholds individual rights, personal autonomy, and limited government. We advocate for a government that is transparent, accountable, and respectful of the rights and freedoms of its citizens. To achieve this, we emphasize the importance of a radically more decentralized system, where power is distributed among independent states. Such a system allows for local governance that is responsive to the needs and desires of its inhabitants, promoting a sense of community and empowering individuals to participate actively in shaping their own lives. Furthermore, we recognize the imperative to restore the integrity of our constitutional republic. We call for an end to the duopoly of power held by the Republicans and Democrats, seeking to foster a political landscape that embraces diverse voices and ideas. Genuine debate and informed decision-making should be the cornerstones of our republic, allowing for the development of well-rounded policies that truly represent the will of the people. We firmly reject the notion that our government should dictate economic decisions or engage in coercive wealth redistribution. Instead, we advocate for the principles of free markets, voluntary exchange, and individual initiative. These principles promote innovation, economic prosperity, and individual fulfillment, as individuals are best suited to make decisions regarding their own lives and economic activities.
So a senior U.S. official said that the death toll caused by Israel's assault on Gaza is likely far higher than the over 10,000 number that's being reported by Gaza's health ministry. So these comments were made by Barbara Leaf. She is an assistant secretary of state for Near Eastern Affairs. And what she said breaks from President Biden's claim that the numbers from Gaza's health ministry can't be trusted. She said, quote, "In this period of conflict and conditions of war, it is very difficult for any of us to assess what the rate of casualties are. We think they're very high, frankly, and it could be that they're even higher than are being cited. We'll know after the guns fall silent. We take in sourcing from a variety of folks who are on the ground. I can't stipulate to one figure or another. It's very possible they're even higher than is being reported," end quote. So the latest numbers from Gaza's health ministry on Thursday put the death toll at 10,569 Palestinians. So this article is from AP, and it's just about the situation for the people on the ground in Gaza, and I just want to read some of it. So fistfights break out in breadlines. Residents wait hours for a gallon of brackish water that makes them sick. Scabies, diarrhea, and respiratory infections rip through the overcrowded shelters, and some families have to choose who eats. So they quote Susan Wahadi. She's an aid worker and a mother of 5 at a UN shelter. And she said, quote, "My kids are crying because they are hungry and tired and can't use the bathroom. I have nothing for them," end quote. So Palestinians who managed to flee Israel's ground invasion in northern Gaza now encounter scarcity of food and medicine in the south, and there is no end in sight to the war that was sparked by the Hamas attack on October 7th. Over 500,000 displaced people have crammed into hospitals and UN schools turned shelters in the south. The schools, overcrowded, strewn with trash, swarmed by flies, have become a breeding ground for infectious disease. Since the start of the war, several hundred aid trucks have entered Gaza through the southern Rafah crossing, but aid organizations say that's a drop in the ocean of need. For most people, each day has become a drudging cycle of searching for bread and water and waiting in lines. And this article just goes on to say how it is straining Gaza's close-knit society. People are getting mad at each other, and this is what happens when populations don't have enough food to eat. People turn on each other, and very ugly things can happen. And talking about the disease and stuff, I mean, if this war continues, and it looks like it's going to continue, I think we're going to start seeing a lot of Palestinians die of disease and hunger, and it's just going to be, it's just an untenable situation for these people, just crammed into these shelters with nowhere to go. So a bipartisan group of 16 members of Congress has called on President Biden to drop the case against WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, warning of the grave threat to press freedom if he is convicted. So the lawmakers made this call in a letter sent to President Biden on Wednesday. The effort was led by Representatives Thomas Massie, Republican from Kentucky, and James McGovern, Democrat from Massachusetts. They began circulating this letter to get their colleagues to sign last month. If you remember, I did cover that when there was news that they were circulating the letter. So now they have sent it. I wish they could have gotten more signatures than 16, but it's something. So one excerpt from the letter, it reads, quote, "It is the duty of journalists to seek out sources, including documentary evidence, in order to report to the public on the activities of government. The United States must not pursue an unnecessary prosecution that risks criminalizing common journalistic practices and thus chilling the work of the free press. We urge you to ensure that this case be brought to a close in as timely a manner as possible," end quote. And this letter comes as the Biden administration has been under pressure from the Australian government to free Assange, who is an Australian citizen. In September, a delegation of Australian members of parliament from across the political spectrum visited Washington and met with U.S. officials to lobby for Assange. Australia's prime minister was also just in Washington, and he brought up Assange with Biden at the White House. Australia's got a lot of leverage they could use, which they're not really using. You know, they could be doing more to put the screws on Biden because they're signed this AUKUS military pact. The U.S. is building up its military footprint in Australia. Doesn't seem like they're trying to leverage anything, though. So Slovakia's new government under Prime Minister Robert Fico has rejected a plan to provide Ukraine with a military aid package that was approved by the previous government. So Fico, whose Smer SD party won elections in October, he campaigned to end military aid to Ukraine, and he's followed through on the promise. His government squashed this weapons package for Ukraine at a cabinet meeting on Wednesday. The military aid package included air defense rockets, 125 millimeter cannon ammunition, and 4 million rounds of small arms ammunition. So Slovakia, you know, is a small NATO country, but they have been providing Ukraine with some significant military aid. They gave Ukraine their MiG-29 fighter jets. Those are Soviet-made jets, making them only the second country after Poland, the second NATO country to give fighter jets to Ukraine. Only Poland and Slovakia have done it yet. You have the other European countries that have promised to send the F-16s, but the training's still in progress. So that's pretty significant aid that they gave. So this is, you know, another sign that Ukraine is going to have trouble maintaining support in the West. Another thing that the new government is against is more sanctions on Russia. Hungary, up to this point, has been the only EU country that kind of tries to, you know, blocks the sanctions on Russia, tries to get them watered down. And, you know, they can cause a lot of trouble, just one country opposing them. So now that there's two, that could be a lot harder for the EU to increase the sanctions.
Here's Gerald Salenti with today's trends in the news.
As I keep saying, when all else fails, they take you to war. It went from the COVID war to the Ukraine war and now the Israel war. So now they hit the markets. Let's see. The S&P 500 slipped 0.8%, snapped its longest winning streak since 2021.
Absolute bullshit.
It ain't a fucking winning streak. It's a rigged fucking game. The whole thing is going down big. Wouldn't you love to be living in the Middle East right now, particularly Israel? Your economy is going to do great. Countries at war. People are, oh yeah. China, again, all the data's in your magazine. The Trends Journal will give you more right now. So why did the markets go down? Quote, the Federal Market Committee, a bunch of fucking scumbags, is committed to achieving a stance. Hey, listen to this fucking crap. Who the fuck are you talking to? The fucking banksters, that a cock-sucking prick, probably a real cocksucker because he wasn't a man, Woodrow Wilson, that gave us World War I, the IRS, federal income tax, and made up the fucking Federal Reserve. Anyway, I got to calm down. The Federal Open Market Committee is committed to achieving a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to bring down inflation to 2% over time. We are not confident that we have achieved such a stance. His remarks to the International Monetary Fund. You mean International Mafia Federation? Oh, this is the Powell. This is the Grand Powell who said there was no inflation. It was only temporary, only transitory. Now swallow more of my shit. It's shit day. It's fucking shit day every day. Shit coming out of the politicians' mouths. The bullshit repeated by the little fucking prostitute ballers. And I can't say the other word. Bitches and bastards. All they're selling is bullshit. That's all they sell. Bullshit. So the market, I'm telling you, man, this thing's going to go down. With the war going on in the Middle East, this is big. It ain't going to stop. Again, nobody has a fucking clue the 39 weeks of protests going on. I ask everybody. They don't know dick about shit about the protests going on in Israel before this happened. They don't know anything about what that, quote, extreme right-wing government, there it all is in your Trends Journal since the beginning of the year, has been doing to the Palestinians. This thing is going to expand. So, and Syria and Iran, what Israel's doing, it can bomb anybody that they want. Again, this is the Crusades 2000 that we have warned about. Yep. Moving on. China deal-making slump sends bankers' fees to lowest in decades. No shit. Writing about it in your Trends Journal week after week after week after week. Now it's in the Wall Street Journal. Chinese markets become investment problem. The second largest economy in the world, going down the crap. But thanks to the COVID war, the zero COVID policy of 3 years of lockdown that fucked the country up. Central banks insist rates will remain higher. Okay. Everybody's saying the rates are going to go higher, and they may. We say they're going to go down in November. Goldman Sachs came out today. They said they're going to go higher. We say they're going to, not November, in next year, for the run-up of the November elections. So we say they're going to go down in 2024. That's our bet. Israel businesses buckle under wars as war inflicts heavy toll. This is Financial Times. Yep. The businesses are fucked. Yep. It's right there. Bloomberg. U.S. debt held by younger than 50-year-old rose to a record in the third quarter. The Dow Jones is doing great. They just had their best time since 2021 as everybody's going fucking broke. Not everybody, the majority. The most indebted households are those between the ages of 40 and 50. Yeah, right at the height of your life. Yep. Auto loan balances rose by $13 billion last quarter to a record $1.6 trillion to buy a piece of fucking shitty car with all this stupid electronic fucking high-tech crap brought to you by the fucking geeks. The trunk opens by itself. Beep, 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 beep. I got a bunch of stupid shit. It keeps going on. Serious delinquencies for auto loans or loans 90 days longer past due are the highest since the Great Recession. For borrowers in their 20s and 30s. The markets are going to go down. The whole fucking thing's going down. But don't worry, when all else fails, they take you to war. 20% of U.S. offices are vacant. This is from CNN. Yeah, no shit. And you know what the office occupancy rate is? According to Castle Systems? 49.6%. That's right. The office building bust is going to bring down the banks. But this is the way that they slant the news to make you hate the people that they want you to. Uruguay pivots to China from U.S. Today's, all right? The world, much of the world has had enough of the United States. Going back to the economy. When interest rates go down, the dollar's going to go down. It's going to be the beginning of the death of the dollar. The world has had enough of America. Gold prices are going to escalate. FDA approves Mounjaro for weight loss. Drug first cleared for diabetes, blah, 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 blah. It's going to cost $1,000, 60 cents a month. You ready? The drug does come with some side effects, the most common being nausea, vomiting, and other gut woes. Isn't that nicely put? Other gut woes. I mean, it'll fuck you up in a lot of different ways, but, you know, don't eat right. No, don't. Oh, matter of fact, it's not just bullshit coming out of my mouth because I'm not a politician. And again, hey, politicians, who the fuck are you to tell me what to do?
Well, I know there was a little bit of talk out of Washington, D.C., that NBC story said that they were about ready to wash their hands of this thing. But I wonder what else going on in D.C. and what else going on in the war. And what all, as you say, what are these three things going on in Russia, too? The floor is yours.
Yeah, so I mean, the three things going on in Russia that didn't get a lot of notice are both international and domestic. The one you were talking about, the NBC article, was interesting, and it came out. There was a constellation of articles that came out at the same time that are showing this growing pressure on Zelensky to perhaps recognize that Ukraine's not going to win the war, that they're not going to achieve their policy goals on the battlefield, that the longer they try, the worse it might get. And so it might be time at last to turn to the negotiating table. The NBC article was interesting, Scott, because it showed really different language than Washington has used before. It suggested that U.S. and European officials have begun to broach the topic with Zelensky of what it might take to negotiate an end of the war. And it also used language of what Ukraine would be willing to give up. So this is really the first time you're seeing leaking into the public, you know, American, European officials not only saying that it might have to come down to negotiations, but that Ukraine might have to give stuff up. And, you know, there's only really two things that they could mean by Ukraine give stuff up, and that would be territory and NATO ambitions. So that was really interesting.
Well, I mean, what you're telling me is they should have negotiated in the first place, Ted, it sounds like.
So, so Scott, that's just the most tragic thing of the war of all, right? Like, it was really clear in the first days, the first weeks, especially March and April, that first year in Istanbul, it was really clear that Zelensky was entirely willing to negotiate into the war. Even before the war, Zelensky was talking about, you know, we'll give up our NATO aspirations, let's talk. And it was really clear in Istanbul. There's no doubt anymore in Istanbul. I would argue there's no doubt anymore in Istanbul that a tentative agreement between Ukraine and Russia had actually been initialed by the two sides. It had gone that far, where Russia had said they would pull back to their pre-war lines and Ukraine would give up its NATO aspirations. They had agreed to that. And this is the tragedy, Scott. The war at that point could have been over before it had escalated into a huge war, before the massive loss of life, before the massive infrastructure damage. Ukraine and Russia were willing to end the war, and the States wasn't.
Yeah.
It's really clear now that the States, in fact, the evidence is getting stronger every week, that the U.S. said no to that. And the result has been, as you said, almost 2 years of horrific loss of life, horrific war that in the end has come down to Ukraine being not in a better position on the battlefield to go to the negotiating table, as Biden kept saying. They're in a worse position on the battlefield than they were when they first reached an agreement with Russia. And now they're being pressured to reach a new agreement with Russia that's going to be worse than the one they could have had 2 years ago. So they're gonna come out of this war with a worse agreement they could have had and hundreds of thousands of more deaths because the U.S. said no. And we know the U.S. said no, not just because Russia has said that, but because the Turkish officials in Istanbul have said that, and the former German Chancellor Schröder was who was there. He was asked by Ukraine to negotiate. He's gone public recently, said that Ukraine said no because the Americans told them so they had to check everything with the Americans. So this is a horrific war that need not have happened, and now U.S. officials are saying to Ukraine, you need to talk about, you need to give up. But remember that what they have to give up, the land, they wouldn't have had to give that up at the beginning because the additional land had been taken. They could have had the Minsk Accords where that land would have just been autonomous. Now the agreement's going to have to be they give it up altogether. So what Ukraine's going to have to give up now is much worse than they would have had to give up before. And they've bought this worse settlement at the price of hundreds of thousands of lives. That's the tragedy. This is all on the U.S. That's the tragedy.
Yeah, and of course we had Ukrainian officials that talked to Ukrainian Pravda right away and told the whole story too. And that came from their side, that they felt pressured by Boris Johnson that, boy, I guess we better do what you say.
Yeah, it seems pretty clear that during those Istanbul talks, Johnson showed up and told them that although you may be willing to negotiate with Putin, we're not. There's also a lot of stories. I haven't seen this absolutely confirmed, Scott, but there's also a lot of stories that Johnson said something like, we want you to keep on fighting. If you do, we'll give you all the weapons you need for as long as you need them. And so, Zelensky walked away thinking he kind of had that guarantee of as much as you need for as long as you need them.
Yeah.
And so there was that, there was that pressure too. And the thing is, as much weapons as you need for as long as you need them, for what? It's become really clear now. I mean, first of all, not news. The Ukrainian counteroffensive has failed, right? But Scott, it hasn't just failed. What happened in the counteroffensive is that Russia took up a strategy of going onto the defensive, not trying to acquire territory, but just watching the Ukrainian troops flood in to their defensive lines and just devour them. So that through this war of attrition, they just devoured Ukrainian soldiers and devoured Ukrainian equipment. And people talk about this sort of this stalemate where in a counteroffensive, Ukraine's only managed to gain 17 kilometers of land. And in the months before that, Russia was only able to acquire, 6 kilometers of land. And this is just a complete mistake of metrics, right? Because it's true that Ukraine's fighting to gain land. They have to. They're trying to kick Russia out of their land. Russia's not fighting to gain land. Russia's fighting to beat the Ukrainian army. And the way they do that is by sitting where they are and just,
right,
mowing down. Like, so it's not true that it's at this sort of stalemate. And what's happened in the Ukrainian counteroffensive is because of this, they haven't just failed. They've had such a massive loss of men and arms that they're now completely vulnerable to a Russian counteroffensive. And so what you're starting to see slowly now is that Russia's moving these defensive lines forward, and they're slowly and methodically acquiring land at enormous loss to Ukrainians. So the counteroffensive actually reduced Ukraine to a position of vulnerability that they're now exposed for the situation to get much, much worse on the battlefield than it is now.
Thank you. I would argue that this is almost entirely the fault of the United States. The Russians and the Ukrainians had an agreement until Boris Johnson and Joe Biden said, "Oh, no, we have your back. You're going to become part of NATO." And then we spent $113 billion, and now the president of the United States has asked the Congress, I don't think he's going to get it, for another $68 billion, all because they want to expand NATO. Will the United States, forget the West does what the U.S. demands. Will the United States ever stop this maniacal expansion eastward of NATO, notwithstanding the natural and probable consequences of such an expansion?
Well, the NATO expansion has stopped because the Russian army has stopped it, in effect. But what continues is the Western insistence that NATO will expand. So the reality is already clear. But the continued insistence that NATO will expand means continued war. This has been my point all along. All Biden had to do, going back years, and as recently as December 2021, before all of this broke out, was to say NATO won't enlarge, and then there would not have been a cause of war. The war would not have taken place. But even till today, they still make these claims that, yes, NATO's going to go to Ukraine. So Russia says, well, if NATO's going to come to Ukraine under your view, why are we to stop right now and let that happen? We've been clear for 30 years and extremely clear since 2007 when President Putin spoke at the Munich Security Conference, and extremely clear since 2008 when Bill Burns sent his "Niet means Niet" memorandum to Condoleezza Rice. That this is a no. So as soon as you stop saying that it's going to happen and we get down to real political negotiations, then there's a possibility of this war ending. This is very basic. And I think what's so important to understand is this is a group that has played a bad poker hand miserably by continuing to up the ante at every stage, knowing that it's a failed hand, or not even recognizing that it's a failed hand. So if you go back, if I might just very quickly, you go back to 2008, all we had to do was not put NATO enlargement on the table. And then in the Yanukovych period, 2010 to February 2014, Russia wasn't demanding territory. Russia was demanding a long-term lease of the Sevastopol naval base. That's all, not territory. And then the United States conspired in the overthrow of Yanukovych. Bad move. That was February 2014. Then Russia took Crimea, not wanting it to fall into NATO hands. But even then, it wasn't demanding the territory of the Donbass, of eastern Ukraine, of Lugansk and Donetsk.
And even then, it was bloodless.
Even then, it was saying, look, don't shell the Russian people. Don't attack them. Give them autonomy under an agreement that was negotiated, the Minsk II agreement. Well, the West, the United States, rejected that. It told Ukraine, you don't have to do that. We don't believe in a federal Ukraine, as if the United States should be the one making a judgment like that, especially after a treaty was negotiated. Then as late as December 2021, when President Putin put on the table a draft U.S.-Russia security agreement, they were not calling for the annexation of eastern Ukraine. They were calling for the Minsk II agreement to be implemented and for NATO to stop saying that it was going to enlarge. In other words, for Ukraine to commit to neutrality. So every step of the way, then the special military operation began on February 24th. And the idea of that was push Zelensky into negotiations. Well, those started a few days after the February 24th incursion. It wasn't to conquer Ukraine. It was to enforce neutrality, stop the NATO enlargement. Zelensky agreed on that in March. The United States rushed in and said, no, you don't agree. We need to weaken Russia. You fight on. We're going to put on all of this weaponry. You're going to get the HIMARS. You're going to get the nuclear option of finance. We're going to cut Russia out of the SWIFT banking system. And all of this predictably failed, overblown hype. And in the end, what we could have expected from the beginning, for Russia, NATO enlargement is an existential issue. NATO is not able to defeat Russia on an existential issue, not least because of 6,000 nuclear weapons, by the way. So there was always a point of escalation. But now with conventional forces, it's been shown to be the case. So you're completely right. This is a disaster that we have made because we absolutely can't listen to anybody else. And President Biden,
Joe Biden is proving the accuracy of what your friend and colleague Henry Kissinger once famously said: it is dangerous to be an enemy of the United States. It is worse to be a friend.
Well, he actually said, if it's quoted correctly, that it's fatal to be a friend.
Wow. All right, that's even stronger.
Now, I don't know if that's apocryphal or not, but that's how I quote him. You know, when you hear "we've got your back" for the U.S. saying it, you better worry, because we had the back of a lot of countries, from Afghanistan and Vietnam, South Vietnam, and many others. And we don't understand the politics of the wars that we get in, because these are all about politics.
Let's
if you
get
don't
into
understand
the
politics, you blow it.
Let's get
Your daily dose of liberty education starts here. The Tom Woods Show.
What history of China do we need to know in order to have the best understanding of what China's up to today?
The U.S. has very fraught relations from 1949 to till the late 1960s with communist China. We have a pair of war scares over Taiwan. And of course, we have actual fighting with the Chinese forces in Korea. My grandfather was there. In the late 1960s, Nixon and Kissinger decided to open to China in order to try and balance against the Soviet Union. So it was Cold War strategy. And this ushers in a period of fairly good U.S. relations with China. However, it requires diplomatic normalization. And this is a process that takes place over the 1970s. It begins with Nixon and what's called the first joint communique. This was an agreement between the heads of state that said there is but one China and Taiwan is a part of it. Because you see, the United States government had been recognizing the Republic, the so-called Republic of China, on Taiwan as the official government, all the way from 1949 to the late 1960s. This process continued through Carter and then Reagan, producing normalized relations and the end of the U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty with Taiwan that had been signed in the 1950s under Eisenhower. And so under these 1, 2, 3 communiques, Nixon, Carter, Reagan, the United States promised to respect Chinese sovereignty and to work towards the peaceful reunification of Taiwan and the mainland, and to slowly over time taper off weapons sales and not to sell them new, more advanced weapons. Not to have high-level diplomatic contacts with Taiwan, not to have military contacts with Taiwan, not to have troops on Taiwan. And over the course of the 1990s, as the China relationship stopped having the same meaning to U.S. strategists, because of course the Soviet Union is gone now. There's no Soviet Union to use China to balance against. Security competition intensifies with China. We have the so-called Third Taiwan Straits crisis, where Bill Clinton sails the aircraft carriers through the Taiwan Strait. This prompts an effort toward military modernization in China that wasn't really noticed and seized upon until the 2010s when you have the pivot to Asia under Obama. So from about 1980 to 2012, you essentially have very good relations between the US and China, focused on integrating China into the world economic system. And the idea here was that as China becomes richer and develops, it will create a middle class who will demand political rights, who will create a republic in China. And then democracies don't fight one another. So this idea of trading with China, incorporating it into the American global system, was going to transform China into a democracy and a compliant security partner, a la the Europeans. That, of course, did not happen. And these sort of mistaken assumptions about what would happen by the 20-teens, early 20-teens, that was being recognized in Washington. A lot of people point to the rise of Xi Jinping as being some great turning point. It really wasn't. It really wasn't. You can find lots of very strident, nationalistic, anti-American rhetoric all the way from Deng and Jiang Zemin. They always viewed it as a partnership of equals, that they were not going to be America's junior partner, and that the United States was going to have to respect Chinese sovereignty and prerogatives. And so today, where the United States is working very hard to contain China, this has created a very fraught period of relations because now, of course, China is pretty wealthy, has modernized its military, and as we saw when Nancy Pelosi took her trip to Taiwan last year, is very, very capable of blockading Taiwan. And that's where we are today, with President Biden saying, even though we no longer have a mutual defense agreement with Taiwan, if attacked, we will defend Taiwan militarily with no authorization from Congress.
The 21st century is going to be economically the century of China. And my children will be living in the 21st century and they're going to be prepared for it. So he certainly feels like it's a good place to invest in. So what's the con view of that?
Well, I would say that a lot of the things that allowed China to become industrialized and rich, those conditions just don't hold anymore. For example, the idea of China being the workshop of the world. Well, China became the workshop of the world due to differentials in labor costs, labor protection, environmental protections. China is no longer the low-cost workshop of everything. If you go to Walmart, for example, one of the things that I do when I go to Walmart is I just pick up random items and look and see where they're made. And several years ago, everything was from China. Today, if you pick it up, you're increasingly getting stuff from Thailand, Vietnam, India. Very interesting stuff. Major multinational corporations are diversifying their supply chains away from China. And there are a variety of reasons for this, some of which have to do with the opacity of the political system. Some of it has to do with how draconian their COVID policy was. We have to imagine some kind of epidemic like that is going to happen again. They shut down their entire economy for years. No multinational wants to deal with that kind of risk. The other thing I would say is China had a surplus of working age population people. That was a one-off boost. That was a great thing they got, but it was one-off. Now China is graying very rapidly. There are going to be half as many Chinese in 50 years as there are now. India is already much more populous than China, eclipsed them far ahead of what people thought was going to happen 20 years ago. I can't emphasize enough just how bad their demographic situation is. The United States and China are militarizing the strait and preparing for a clash over the island. People are seeing that, you know what, there are a lot of additional risks that don't show up in just a basic bean counting estimation of this, and maybe we need to get our stuff out of there. So in terms of fighting over Taiwan just for chips, no, not worth it, not worth it. And the hawks will generally talk in terms of the technology will fall into China's hands. And that's why we need to do it. That would never happen because the United States has already said publicly they would destroy, that they would literally bomb out of existence those very factories if a war over Taiwan started and they thought they were going to lose, which it looks like they would. So it's not as though China would even get hold of these plants in the event of a conflict. So no, I don't think it's worth it. I think it is a pretext, like so many other things. I mean, even if China had them, why wouldn't China want to sell them to the rest of the world, right? Well, what good is it just to hold all of the semiconductors? Doesn't make any sense. But of course, if you watch like Meet the Press or something like that, follow-up questions are never asked. It's just, why should we fight over chips? Well, we should do it for this reason. It's like, well, that sounds good to me.
Yeah, right.
Sounds
Well,
good
the
to
same
me.
thing was about oil.
Right.
So-and-so's going to have all the oil.
Yeah.
But what would you do with it? I mean, unless you have a fetish for it, what would you do with it?
Drink it?
Yeah.
The Peter Schiff Show.
Now, Powell also talked about the consumer again, right? The resilient. This is his favorite word, just like, transitory was when he talked about inflation. It's resilient, right? Every time he talks, that's his word, right? Resilient consumer. Well, I mean, is the consumer really that resilient? I mean, sure, he's still spending money, but you've got to look at why. I mean, it's not like, the consumer is resilient like Superman is resilient to bullets, right? You shoot Superman and the bullets just bounce off his chest, like no big deal. The consumer is not resilient like that. The consumer is getting shot and those bullets are hurting. They're doing damage, right? The consumer is bleeding and hurting, but he's still breathing. He's still alive. He's badly wounded, but he's resilient enough not to be dead. And how is the consumer staying alive, with all these bullets, right? Well, one way he's doing that is by depleting his savings, right? A lot of consumers, got a big boost. They got these COVID stimulus checks, and so they had those, and so they spent that. That's gone. The other thing the consumer is doing is, maxing out the credit cards. Credit card debt is at an all-time record high, even though credit card interest rates are at an all-time record high. It's almost 21% now is the average rate on credit card debt. What's the other thing that's enabling the consumer to survive all these bullets is taking on additional jobs. I've been discussing that on the podcast. We got, again, on the jobs numbers that we got last week, and I think that's also what's driving the narrative that the Fed is done hiking, is based on how weak the non-farm payroll report was last week. It was extremely weak. But one thing that was strong was second and third jobs. It was a surge, almost 400,000. We have more Americans than ever before working 2 or 3 jobs. That's how the consumer is remaining resilient. He's working more, right? And that's what he needs to do to keep on spending. So deplete your savings, max out your credit cards, and get a sucking job. Now, if you want to describe that as well, we got this resilient consumer. The consumer is going to bleed out because eventually there's no way to survive. He's mortally wounded. He's just delaying death by all of these means that he has at his disposal. All right, so one thing that happened during the week that really was a shot across the bow with this bull market, and it should have done more damage. And in fact, the market sold off on Thursday, the stock market, the bond market, in reaction to this. But the government held its routine Treasury bond auction. And this particular auction that we had yesterday was one of the weakest auctions they've ever had, meaning that it was very sloppy. There was not a lot of demand for treasuries. Now, I don't know why there's any demand for treasuries, and eventually there won't be, but there was enough demand to get the auction off, but in a very bad way. I mean, people that were grading this, would give it an F. I think Rick Santelli gave it a D- because, there were enough buyers there to get it done, right? It wasn't like a failed auction where the Treasury held an auction and nobody showed up or not enough people showed up. They showed up, but not in a big way. The cover ratio was 2.23, which was the lowest since December of 2021. But more importantly, the tail in this auction was the longest ever. And that is an indication of weakness. And what the tail is in a bond auction is it's the difference between the average rate on the bonds and the highest rate that the government has to pay. And so when you have a long tail, that means in order to complete the auction, it had to extend out to bidders that didn't want to pay as much. And this was the longest tail since they started measuring it. And so that indicates that the government is running out of buyers. They haven't run out completely yet, but it was a bad auction, and it doesn't bode well for Treasury bonds and for the U.S. economy. But the market's already shrugged that off today, right? We had a huge rally
in the stock market today. So, they shrugged it off. But this is a bad sign. It's what I've been warning about. And eventually, the auctions are going to be a lot worse than this, because eventually there won't be enough buyers. I mean, why people want to buy these bonds? Investors still believe that inflation is going to go down. I mean, they still think the Fed's going to succeed in lowering inflation down to 2%. I mean, that's why gold had such a bad week, because even though the stock market rallied on the idea that the Fed is done hiking and is going to start cutting, the expectations are that even though the Fed is cutting, it's only going to be 75 basis points. The markets expect inflation to drop a lot more than 75 basis points. And so the expectation is for real interest rates to go up. And it's the expectation of higher real interest rates that is weighing on the gold price. I mean, it's pushing up the dollar somewhat, but it's weighing more heavily on gold because everybody thinks gold is a function of real rates. And as long as real interest rates are rising, that's bad for gold. Now, in a way, they're right. Positive real interest rates is good for gold, but we don't actually have positive real interest rates because the inflation rate is made up. What they're looking at is the CPI, the official government measure of inflation, and they're using that to determine whether rates are negative or positive. But they're actually negative. We don't have positive real rates. We have negative real rates if you use a real rate of inflation instead of a phony rate of inflation. But the reality is, rather than real interest rates rising, which is what the gold traders expect, real interest rates are going to collapse when inflation takes off. And in the face of that, the Fed cuts rates anyway, because the Fed is more concerned about propping up the financial system, the banks, the government, bailing out everybody, trying to kick the can down the road. We know what the Fed is going to do. When push comes to shove, they already showed their hand earlier this year when we had the beginning of the banking crisis back in March. I mean, every time there's been a crisis, the Fed has responded the same way. And I'm confident that they're going to continue that, despite the fact that inflation is so much higher than their 2% target. But because inflation is so much higher than their 2% target, they're not going to get the benign outcome that they're used to. The stimulus is going to be a sedative, and it's going to be a dollar crisis and a sovereign debt crisis.
You run your mouth and I run my business, brother. You tell everybody I'm busted. You talk so much you got me disgusted. But you run your mouth and I run my business, brother.
The next that we saw from some spin from what's going on, Israel, Gaza thingy things. Israel sees military control over Gaza after the war. European Union and Muslim majority countries or the local political leaders in Gaza said, all right, here's the part I want to focus on. We don't want to govern Gaza. We don't want to have to run their lives. We just want to protect our people. I don't know. This is just what they keep saying. It's like, we're doing all these horrible things, and we don't want to do all these horrible things. It's just that we want this other thing. It's like, we don't want to have to tax you. We just want to fund you. You're still doing it. It doesn't matter what, like, in my opinion, it doesn't matter what got you there. And sure, I guess there's a distinction between somebody who wants to kill you just for the thrill of killing you and somebody that wants, I'm only killing you because you have money in your house and I want to take your money. I'd rather not have to kill you. Yeah, sure. I guess there's a distinction between that and a serial killer. But at the end of the day, you're killing somebody. And they keep going with this. Like, we don't want to have to do this. Some other spin. Oh, well, this was just kind of the latest from Israel. Israel agrees to 4-hour daily pause in Gaza fighting to allow civilians to flee, White House says. Let's just read this. This is from the AP. Similar short-term pauses have occurred over the last several days as tens of thousands of civilians have fled southward. But Thursday's announcement appeared to be an effort to formalize and expand the process as the U.S. has pressed Israelis to take greater steps to protect civilians in Gaza. Biden's push for an even longer pause comes as part of a renewed diplomatic push to free hostages taken by Hamas and other militant groups to the Gaza Strip during their October 7th surprise attack on Israel. Israeli officials estimate that militants to blah, blah, blah. Kirby told reporters Thursday that the pause could be useful to getting all 239. All right. The point I want to harp in on is that the claim has been that the Israelis have told these people to leave and they've chosen not to, or they've been forced to remain as human shields. So isn't the fact that after pressure from outside forces agreeing to create some sort of a humanitarian corridor and giving people 3-hour warning that they'll have a 4-hour window in which to pass through your corridor would imply the fact that you were keeping people in the area against their will? Isn't there an implication of the fact that after being forced to provide people a safe way of passage, that they didn't previously have a safe way of passage? And so therefore, when you were killing them, it's not that they just chose to remain and be a human shield? Because remember, the old system was, you drop a leaflet on their house, you tell them that they're it. If they choose to stay, then they've chosen to be a human shield, and then you have no choice. You'd rather just get the terrorists, but you have no choice but to kill them. But isn't this a little bit of an admission of the fact that I guess you were involved in them being held there, or that you weren't giving them the proper opportunity to leave? And then even this just seems like, imagine if no one was being killed, but they were just being forced from their homes. Why is that okay? I was reading this article, Northern Gaza exodus surges as siege builds, and it was getting into the fact that they're being sent to like some beach that isn't really set up to house them, and they're even talking about old people basically just being like pushed in computer chairs, and you're like, why is that even an option? I get that I'm not fully researched on who's here, who's there, how much Hamas hates Israel, and what the workable solutions are. But I don't know, the concept of we're just going to indiscriminately blow up people's houses, or hey, we told them just to abandon their home and go to an area for an unknown amount of time without the resources to have them. And so if they chose not to do so, well, then them being blown up in their own home is on them. All right, moving on. Zelensky calls for unity, says time isn't right for elections. That's some world-class government spin right there. Isn't that great? Zelensky calls for unity, says time isn't right for elections. That seems like a convenient way to become a dictator. King Charles expressed his deepest regrets for violence during Kenya's independence struggle from Britain, but didn't offer apology that victims and their descendants called for. To be honest, I wasn't even familiar of this violence during the Kenyan incident, so as far as I'm concerned, I could have just gone with regrets. I didn't really need his deepest regrets. All right, here's the next one is you got this ongoing Hunter probes, and I think the latest is that they're saying that they've we'll get to it later in the show. But I was once talking to a friend of mine about some professional problems I was having at work. And he was telling me that they got this role because he's got all the fancy corporate training. He's worked for all the big companies. And he said one of the big things that you have to do when you work at a big old fancy corporation is you got to get everybody in the room. You got to get all the different agencies, all the different people. You got to get everyone in the room. Because if anyone's not in the room, everyone's going to point the finger and say there was a miscommunication with that person. It was a miscommunication with that department. Oh, I assigned it to this department. Well, I handed it over to Steve. Well, I handed it over to Mike. Well, Mike said that Steve was working on it. Well, when Steve re-reviewed it, he said that he was missing the paperwork from Mike and handed it back to Mike. When Mike looked at it, he realized he had to wait till he got this information from payroll. Oh, payroll never even saw this document. How's it possible that payroll never saw the document? Well, it's because Mike never handed it to payroll. Oh, Mike, is it true you never handed it to payroll? Well, that was because of the conversation I had with Steve. There you go. That's all of corporations in a nutshell. And that's why you got to do, what you got to do when you got to be a manager? You got to get everybody in the room. You got to get Steve in the room. You got to get payroll in the room. You got to get Mike in the room. And that's why you can actually solve who's responsible for what, who made what decision, who needs to be fired, who needs to be promoted, and you can start fixing the problems. Because if not, it's always a Mike gave it to Steve, gave him a telephone, blame it on payroll, circle jerk. I've noticed that when it comes to government, we have that exact problem. You got 45 different branches. It's always a miscommunication. You never get everybody in the room. So you get Garland in the room, and he goes, well, that guy had complete authority to do it. Then you get the guy who they said had complete authority to go do the investigation, and he starts going, well, yeah, I had the complete authority, but it wasn't in a nutshell. And this is no way to manage and figure out what went wrong. You have to actually get Garland in the room. You got to get this guy in the room. You got anyone else that they can possibly blame, and you got to get them all in the room and go, why was this decision made? That's the only way you ever get to the bottom of these things. But government's not set up for that. Government, if anything, it wants to run its efficiencies and then go, you know what we need? We need a Department of Inefficiencies to study the inefficiencies. And they go, you know what? We just didn't have enough money here for the Department of Inefficiencies. With more money at the Department of Inefficiencies, we can finally get rid of these inefficiencies. And you're like, dude, you guys have had so much more money. Every single year we give you more and more money, and we're doing nothing but tracking more efficiencies. That's because you didn't give us enough money, and there's also that inflation problem. All right, anyways, let's actually read these two paragraphs that I highlighted from the article. I am and have been the decision maker on this case, we said, according to an opening statement issued during the closed-door hearing, transcripts of which weren't immediately made public. I do not, however, make these decisions in a vacuum. There are processes that I must adhere to in making investigative and charging decisions. These processes did not interfere with my decision-making authority. So therefore, I had the full authority, but I had to talk to other people. So it's not on me. It's on the process. I don't know. Bullshit.
Today in history, November 10th, 1798, the Kentucky General Assembly passed resolutions drafted by Thomas Jefferson in response to the hated Alien and Sedition Acts, and they are loaded with Jeffersonian principles on the structure of the Constitution. So on this episode, I've got 5 of those core principles rooted in the principles of the American Revolution, the radical change in the viewpoints of the people from 1760 or so till the shot heard round the world in 1775, plus a bonus 6th one if I have time on what to do about usurpation of power. And let's start it out with the first one, and that is that government does not have unlimited power. That is the basis of everything. It is only authorized to do a certain amount of things. And that's how he starts out these resolutions. Resolved that the several states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government. And if we look to the Declaration of Independence, that list of grievances, which were really called in the Declaration itself, injuries and usurpations, This is one of them, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with a power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. And of course, if you've been following the show, you know that that's in reference to the Declaratory Act of 1766, where the King and British Parliament claimed power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. This is unlimited power. Thomas Paine, of course, said such unlimited power can belong only to God, and that's why you had to keep fighting even when the odds were so much against them in the winter of 1776. This was the root cause of the controversy between the colonies and Great Britain, that they claimed this unlimited power over them in all cases whatsoever. So it's no surprise that Jefferson started out his Kentucky resolutions with that in the first line. So number 2 is about consent, but he ties it in here near the end with this idea of all cases whatsoever, unlimited power. And he's talking about how the resolution should be passed along to other states. And he says it is our hope, basically, that they will concur with this Commonwealth in considering the said acts as so palpably against the Constitution as to amount to an undisguised declaration that the compact, that's the Constitution, is not meant to be the measure of the powers of the general government, but that will proceed in the exercise over these states of all powers whatsoever. Jefferson certainly knew what he was doing when he used that phrase, all powers whatsoever. Anyone who knew anything at the time knew this was a reference to the British claiming power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever in the Declaratory Act. And he goes on, he says that they will view this as seizing the rights of the states and consolidating them in the hands of the general government with a power assumed to bind the states, not merely in cases made federal, so those in pursuance of the Constitution, of the delegated powers of the Constitution, but in all cases whatsoever, by laws made not with their consent, but by others against their consent. So if the people of the several states consented through the ratification process just a few years, not that long before this, they consented to a constitution which created a new general government, and that general government was only authorized to exercise certain powers that were in the Constitution. That means they did not consent to the government going beyond those limits. And as soon as they go beyond that, that is an injury and it's a usurpation. It's also something that is listed in the Declaration of Independence. The word consent is in there a few times. For example, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Number 3 is really that 10th Amendment argument about delegated and reserved powers, a line in the sand about what the general government is authorized to do, the federal government, and what is reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. And he points out, again, the states are not united on a principle of unlimited submission, but he said that by compact under the style and title of a Constitution for the United States and of amendments thereto, they constituted a general government for special purposes, delegated to that government certain definite powers, reserving each state to itself the residuary mass of right to their own self-government. And when you're talking about the people of the several states, again, this is about they consented to the Constitution at that time, and they all delegated a certain amount of power, and everything else is not with their consent. And there is a clean line in the sand. Now, number 4 is that the Constitution is supreme, not the government. The government doesn't get to determine the limits of itself. It is the created, the people of the several states created via the Constitution, the general government. So the general government doesn't get to determine the limits of its own power, because again, that would give them unlimited power. And this is how Jefferson described it. The government created by this compact was not made the exclusive or final judge of the extent of the powers delegated to itself, since that would have made its discretion and not the Constitution the measure of its powers. So for Thomas Jefferson, the people of the several states created a constitution. They created a set of limited delegated powers that the general government was authorized to exercise. And it wasn't up to that government to determine whether or not it was going beyond the limits of its own powers. He said, but that, as in all other cases of compact among parties having no common judge, each party has an equal right to judge for itself, as well of infractions as of the mode and measure of redress. So each party to the compact, and the parties to the compact, as James Madison also described in his report of 1800 about the Virginia resolutions of 1798, that the parties to the compact are the people of the several states. So ultimately, the sovereignty, final authority is with the people of the several states, and each state, the people, can make their own determination of whether or not they view something as constitutional or not. Maybe it's just expressing opinion, but if they have that opinion, it is also up to them to determine how they want to deal with it, the mode and measure of redress. So number 4 is constitutional supremacy, not federal supremacy. And number 5, we're just going to use one word, void. And here's Jefferson's take. Whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force. If the government, by exercising powers not delegated to it, is consequently exercising, in essence, setting the foundation for unlimited power, then automatically, in principle and in theory, any power that's not authorized to them, not delegated to them, is void. That's the same principle that Patrick Henry took in response to the Stamp Act, because if it's void, and even Alexander Hamilton in Federalist 33 talking about federal supremacy, and this is my paraphrase, he said, those acts that are not supreme are usurpations of power and deserve to be treated as such. So if you're treating something that is void, a usurpation of power as such, it's as if it doesn't exist. So it has no force in law. And this is very similar to what James Otis Jr. Now, John Adams referred to James Otis Jr.'s speech against the writs of assistance in 1761 as the beginning of the controversy between the colonies and Great Britain. And this is James Otis, many things that he said in that long speech, but he said an act against the Constitution is void, because if they're not authorized to do it, it is not law, and therefore no one is bound to obey it.
That we're going to be talking about a lot bigger than most people are starting to recognize. It was 2 days ago the payments on the national debt went to over $1 trillion, and nobody cares. They're still, even this week, Republicans and Democrats were spending more money, sending more money overseas, looking for another fight someplace. It's has no effect on the warmongering and the militarism that we have, and no effect on the welfare state, because we have to be humanitarians. We don't want to be accused of not liking people. But if you had freedom, that would be the real, generous offers to people, because that's where people prosper, and people generally prosper with their civil liberties when they don't have war to worry about. But anyway, that's a big event. It's a seminal event, and there's been several of those throughout the history, starting with the Federal Reserve Board, and systematically we undermined the gold standard. It took over 100 years to totally destroy it, and it's been getting weaker and weaker.
Yes, Dr. Paul, that chart is very telling. And pretty scary, because interest payments can bury you. That's when the end game shows up. And our financial situation is very similar to the medical debacle that we went through. It was paved by experts, and this financial disaster is paved by experts. The job of an economist, a real economist, is to tell politicians what they cannot do. Because politicians, they're driven by what the public wants, and a lot of times what the public wants is just not viable. So the economist, his job is to tell the politician the truth. You can't give something away for free. It's not free. You can't fix the price of that. Who do you think you are? You can't fix prices. Prices are not arrived by dictate. You're going to create a disaster. But unfortunately, that's not what an economist today does. If you want to be a successful economist, you have to tell the politician that's a great idea. And then you go to the public and explain that, yes, free healthcare is a great idea. Free this, free that. And you'll become somebody, in the economic world publicly. Now, it's all a lie, but, people don't really care about that. They, if they can live a good life materially, they'll go on TV and say debt doesn't matter and deficits don't matter. Just print more money. There's always somebody that's willing to do that. So that's what an economist has become today. And that's why we have this financial debacle that is just waiting to hit us hard. But again, there was nobody telling the truth. So the Americans don't know the truth. And, down this bad road, we continue to go.
The banking system prior to 1913 still had difficulties. It was not perfect. They suspended it during the Civil War. And yet there was still a lot of respect for the gold standard. So when they would wander off and cause a recession, they always went back to the gold. But in 1913, it was decided the bankers got together and they had the Federal Reserve Act passed. And this was, the purpose of it was to stabilize the banking system. And just think in our short period of time, in the last 20 years, how many unstable banks have we dealt with? But it wasn't permanent. It was bad and horrible, but it's going to get a lot worse because they were always bailed out because there was still some trust in fiat. But we have this printed press money, so we can bail banks out and stabilize it. As long as the banks are stable, people don't have to worry about their deposit. It used to be even the average depositor would lose their money, no government insurance. I don't think people are going to lose that anymore. That shouldn't give you reassurance. It just means that the government is going to paper everything over, and that is what the fiat is all about. All the junk bonds, because they over-invest in the government programs, put it in the housing bubble. Everybody should have known there was a bubble, and the bubble collapsed. But that was in 08, and now we're in a position now where they can't stop spending. There's too many powerful political forces. We have a foreign policy that's doomed to fail. And the big question is, what's going to happen next? And that is a big question. The one thing is I have no confidence that we're going to get enough help in Washington that they will devise a system that will be smart and deliberate, and the people will understand why you have to start living within your own means. No, they want money to solve the problem, and that's what they do. They come in and they print more money, and yet it doesn't work. So that's where we are. This announcement that we went over, this landmark-ish date of $1 trillion a year. It may turn out to be a bigger one-day event than what I thought was happening in 1971.
I think so too, Dr. Paul. And unfortunately, this is going to catch a lot of people by surprise. And by this, I don't mean today or tomorrow, whenever. The numbers, you can't beat this. So, and we can't expect, to go to the television and to be soothed that they're going to tell you the truth. Hopefully we have a lot of precedents that we're going through of just how much this propaganda machine lies. I mean, obviously COVID, and that I think had a major effect on people. However, people still go back to the TV. I don't understand it. Even after COVID, they'll go back and, we went through the Ukraine thing and look how long that lasted. And people were told over and over, Ukraine is winning. They're going to win. We have to keep sending them money, sending them weapons. And Zelensky's meeting with actors and this and that. It's all big show. He's globetrotting. And then all of a sudden gone. Putin, I guess, is not going to take over Europe and not going to be the next Hitler, but everybody's moved on. So it's, once you see this, it's like getting yourself out of a cult with this media. So, because when you turn on that television, you're going to hear all the lies. You'll have the Fed go, oh, we need to get up to 2%. And now they're saying, oh, no, we need to get down to 2%. And, this week, somebody went on, an advisor, I talked about advisors, my first thing. An advisor to Biden went on television and said, I don't think there's a leader out there who wouldn't rather have the economic record that President Biden has today. And she said it with a straight face right on television, and people watch it, and I guess some of them believe it. So it's important to turn away from the propaganda machine because it is not your friend. It's your enemy. If there's one thing that Trump got right, it's that the media is the enemy. And, that's the only way. The more people that get out and rip themselves away from it, the better off we'll be.
In reclaiming our individual independence, we commit ourselves to protecting the rights of every individual, regardless of race, gender, or any other characteristic. We firmly reject any form of discrimination or collectivism that undermines the principles of individual liberty and equality before the law. Each person deserves to be treated with dignity, respect, and fairness, and it is up to each individual to uphold these principles in our interactions and institutions. People are free to not be respectful, and they are free to act in ways we may disagree with, but the line is drawn when one side initiates force. The initiation of force is morally wrong, no matter what justification is offered. Far too often groups have captured the government and used it to initiate force on their behalf. This would be impossible in a society that took seriously the responsibilities that accompany freedom. We affirm our dedication to a society that upholds the principles of justice, accountability, and the rule of law. To achieve this, we call for the abolition of qualified immunity, ensuring that government officials are held accountable for any abuses of power and violations of individual rights. We call for the pushers of wars that have cost the lives of countless millions to be held responsible for the lies they told that put that blood on all of our hands. No individual, regardless of their position or authority, should be above the law or immune to the consequences of their actions. Murder is murder, and mass murder is mass murder, even if the government has sold fear to make the people accept an unjust no-win war. In conclusion, we, the individuals of America, declare our unwavering commitment to the principles of liberty, individual rights, and limited government. We assert our right to be free from unjust infringements upon our liberties, and our resolve to safeguard these rights for ourselves and future generations. We invite all like-minded individuals to join us in this pursuit of individual independence, self-governance, and the restoration of true freedom.